In his unguarded moments, Lucas Kelly would admit to his closest friends that what he liked best about his job was the feeling he was the master of his own private universe. "You name it, I can find it out," he'd brag. "Once they set foot inside these four walls, they're mine." Those friends who'd once worked alongside Kelly in ASIO, Australia's internal spy agency, took his claims with a pinch of salt. So what if there are 300 CCTV cameras monitored 24/7 by a team of 14 operatives covering every square inch of the hotel, casino and gardens? These days, it's like that everywhere you go, especially somewhere like Macau, which is effectively under Chinese state control, as well as being the most densely populated region in the world. And so what if the X-ray machine at the front entrance also takes high-resolution images of the bag's contents, sending them over an encrypted wireless system to the security office for examination? Every five-star hotel security manager with a background in the intelligence world is using the same tricks and gadgets. Is it impressive? Yes. But a hotel's a hotel, they'd say. And once they're inside, guests can pretty much do what they like. Right? Lucas would smile and nod. He knew when to stop sharing his secrets. Because the truth was that the surveillance and monitoring system he'd built over the course of the last 5 years only really got going once guests were inside the hotel. There were the cleaners who filed reports each day on the contents of the rooms they serviced. There were the whores who fed back tidbits about the peccadillos of their clients. There was the VIP wristband given to high rollers that also served as a tracking device and a heart rate monitor to give the house an additional edge on the poker tables. Lucas had brought in an old ASIO colleague to fit hundreds of covert listening devices, concealed in picture frames, lamps, even in velvet-covered bed headboards, all over the hotel premises. His capabilities even extended to what he euphemistically referred to as kinetic action. More than once he'd rolled up his sleeves and joined his team of former Aussie Special Forces operatives as they took a thief or card counter to a basement room and taught them a lesson that would ensure they never wanted to come back to the hotel ever again. That was what he'd say as he put his face close up to theirs, studying the broken teeth and bruised flesh. "This is my hotel, buddy. It's not yours. If I see you here again, forget about walking out." Lucas had capabilities, resources, and reach that the heads of CIA, MI6, and every other spy agency in the world would kill for. And that was what made it incredibly frustrating. He still couldn't work out what the guest who had checked in at 9:30 last night was really up to. Philippe Montreux looked like any young poker player. His passport said he was Swiss, but there was something about his blonde hair and bone structure that made Lucas think of Scandinavia. He wore a loose-fitting hoodie that did nothing to hide a powerful physique. He refused the wristband that Lucas had instructed the front desk to offer him. There was no trace of his name in the database of known players shared by the world's leading gambling destinations. The images from the scan of his bags were so ordinary that Lucas fed them into a sophisticated AI-powered analytical tool, and that revealed the existence of a new technology Lucas had only heard rumours of but never seen. It projected an image outward to the scanning device while concealing the bag's actual contents. Lucas assembled a team. Card sharks and petty thieves were one thing, but he was paid the big bucks to prevent the type of incident that would damage a hotel and casino's reputation and wipe millions off its value. An assassination, for example. He knew through his network of contacts in the hotel business that such things happened regularly. It wasn't so frequent as to be obvious to the man on the street, but in the last year alone, Lucas knew there'd been one hit in Dubai, one in Kuala Lumpur, one in Hong Kong, and 2 in Vienna. And those were the ones he knew about. He was certain there were others that hadn't come across his radar. Nobody wanted to admit that they'd let such a thing happen on their patch. It was the surest way to flush a perfectly good career down the toilet. It didn't take long for Lucas to confirm his suspicions. Montreux stopped in his room for 5 minutes and then went down to the casino and played at several poker and blackjack tables from 10 until 2:30. Although he won steadily and displayed decent skill, it was clear that his real interest lay in a Chinese businessman named Bo Zhang playing at the high rollers table. The cameras Lucas had installed didn't just watch a player from a distance, they zeroed in to track their target's eye movements, and it was clear that despite a high level of self-discipline and professionalism, Montreux showed an unusual level of interest in the 60-year-old tech tycoon. Whatever Montreux had in mind, Lucas couldn't allow it to go ahead. He needed to step in, and fast. He came up with a plan of action and briefed his team. Camera footage from the casino suggested Montreux was winding up for the night, presumably after collecting whatever information he needed. Lucas ran through the plan to the team. Once he was back in his room, he said he would visit with just one of the team to avoid being too conspicuous. Lucas would do the talking, tell him there'd been a problem with the payment and that Montreux needed to come down to the front desk. It would be over once he was in the lift. Lucas would press the button for the sub-basement, where the rest of the team would be waiting. "How hard are we going to go?" said one of his team. "As hard as we need. I don't care if he's working for the Americans or the British. This is our territory. We need to make that clear. No one shits where I eat." Lucas knew it wouldn't be the Australians. He made a point of maintaining a good relationship with his former employers, and he was certain they wouldn't try something like this on his patch without asking for his permission. MI6 or CIA going after a Chinese target. Much more likely. He watched Montreux walking down the corridor. He went into his room. He checked his team. "Ready?" "Boss, look." Lucas turned to the bank of CCTV monitors. 3 men dressed in black, their faces obscured by caps pulled down low, were walking towards Montreux's room. "What the hell? Who are they?" The men used a key card to enter Montreux's room. There were no cameras inside, so Lucas couldn't see what happened next, but the audio from a microphone concealed in a lampshade crackled as Montreux yelled in surprise. It sounded like the men were beating him. Lucas was in Montreux's room in 3 minutes. The chair at the desk had been tipped over, the glass coffee table was smashed, and splashes of fresh blood had been cast across the carpet, wallpaper, and bedsheets. Montreux wasn't there. Chapter 2. Charlie Cooper was sensitive enough to the mood of a room that he knew that something was wrong the moment he set foot in Control's office. There were obvious signs, the fatigue etched onto Control's face and the stiffness of his posture, and an intangible quality too, something Cooper's years of experience had taught him to note. Control didn't waste any time getting down to business. He opened a desk drawer and removed a file. Clipped to the front was a colour photograph. He slid the file towards Cooper across the wide mahogany desk. It was a wide-angle shot of a hotel room that looked entirely normal, save the blood splatter across the bedsheets and curtains. "Messy," he said. "Whose blood is that?" "A new operative we've been considering for the group with the cryptonym North Star. This was the last test before we brought him in." "Looks like he failed." Control gestured towards the picture. "This was 3 days ago in Macau. He was there to deal with a man called Bo Zhang, big figure in the Chinese tech scene." "Macau's not an easy place to operate," Cooper said. "No. In hindsight, I might have erred giving this to North Star. It was probably something better saved for someone with more experience." He made a tiny gesture with his hand towards Cooper, the closest he'd ever come to doling out praise. Cooper was still fighting his way back into Control's good graces after disobeying his orders. That would normally have elicited a harsh response, a professional termination for sure, and maybe more, and Cooper knew he had been lucky to avoid it. What happened? North Star surveilled Zhang, but before he could get close enough to him to execute his orders, 3 men entered his room and did this. He gestured at the photograph. Where did we get the picture from? The hotel security manager is a former Australian spook, Lucas Kelly. He still maintains cordial relations with his old employers and passes along gossip, rumours, that sort of thing. Once or twice he's helped them bug the room of one of their targets. I pulled a string or two and they passed this on. Obvious question, where's North Star now? No idea. Dead or alive? Control shook his head. They would have killed him in his hotel room if that was what they wanted to do. The assessment is that he was taken by surprise, so they could have put a bullet in his head immediately and then exfiltrated. But they didn't do that. I think we can assume they wanted him alive. Do we know anything about the men who did it? Kelly has CCTV everywhere, and they've gone over every second. He doesn't think the men arrived together. They probably came in separately during the day, but it's impossible to narrow it down more than that. The hotel's big, over 3,000 guests, and daily footfall at weekends is in the thousands, with every nationality and profile. Needle in a haystack, quite. Easy to get in, Cooper said, but harder to get out, especially if you're moving a body or someone who doesn't want to go with you. Harder, but clearly not impossible. Kelly is looking at the kitchens as the way out. The hotel has hundreds of menial staff, pot washers, cleaners, waiters, and they don't run full checks on them all. Plus deliveries coming and going. Cooper sucked on his teeth. Do we think the team responsible was connected to the target? Personal security? That was my first assumption, but we've got the tightest of nets thrown over his communications. GCHQ and the NSA are involved, and there's not even the smallest of signs he was aware of this. I'm reluctantly coming around to the conclusion that someone unconnected with the Chinese found out that North Star was going to be in Macau and kidnapped him. Cooper looked out of the window and exhaled. The group's operational security, OPSEC, was kept tight on a need-to-know basis, and, generally, agents didn't need to know anything beyond what they had been asked to do. But Cooper had never heard of an operative being kidnapped. Killed, yes. Every operative went into the field knowing that mission might be their last. But the thought that an unknown enemy had infiltrated the group so they knew of North Star's mission and then dispatched a team to take him alive, that was chilling. No wonder Control looked as though he hadn't slept. I know what you're thinking, 11, but you'd be wrong. No one other than me and North Star knew what he was sent to do. Cooper glanced around the office. Have you... Control cut him off. Please. It's been swept. More than once. Cooper nodded. Permission to speculate? Please do. There are a couple of obvious reasons you might kidnap someone. Ransom, obviously, but that seems unlikely. Very. So, it must be someone who wants information on the group. Personnel, techniques, resources, agent identities. Anyone serious enough to do something like this would know that'd be a waste of time. You know how compartmentalization works. What could North Star tell anyone that'd be even remotely helpful? He was originally put in Group 5 as a courier. Even once we'd decided he had real ability and transferred him, we still made sure he was ring-fenced. He's the same as you and everyone else. No knowledge about other agents, and he only knows about the operations he's done himself. Control reached out and pulled the file back towards him, flipping it open. He flicked through the pages in silence. Cooper knew better than to interrupt him. He has an interesting background. He was a Finnish soldier originally, specializing in Arctic warfare. He is logical, controlled, very effective, but he's only been out on 3 solo operations and never worked alongside another agent. Of all the operatives someone could have squeezed for information, he's the one who could probably reveal the least. He sighed. It's an unusual choice. That's what I don't understand. A bargaining chip? For what? It's not as though we have a prison filled with enemy operatives. We kill them, not bring them back here in handcuffs. Control closed the file and pushed it back towards Cooper. Look into it, 11. Find out who took him, why they took him, and what they've done with him. He was sending us regular updates from Macau as per protocol. It's all in the file. Go through it and get some answers. In Macau? Not yet. It's too hot. Cooper stood, picked up the file and walked to the door. Oh, 11. Cooper stopped and turned. Sir? Watch your back. If someone found out about North Star, we have to assume they're more than halfway to finding out about you as well. Chapter 3. Cooper leaned back in the shabby armchair and looked around. North Star's London apartment was nothing to look at. Getting inside had been easy. Cooper had waited for 20 minutes until a pizza delivery man was buzzed in by another resident and then followed behind him. North Star's apartment was on the top floor. Cooper knelt before the lock, anticipating something complex and technical that would test his abilities, but found only a run-of-the-mill chub that he opened in under a minute. It didn't take long to realise why North Star hadn't bothered to upgrade the security. The apartment contained almost nothing of any value, apart from a wall-mounted TV and a set of dumbbells that might fetch 50 quid on eBay. The wardrobe held a few shirts and an old pair of running shoes, and the kitchen cupboards were bare, apart from a stack of tinned tuna. There was a laptop charger, but no laptop. Cooper could hear something rattling around in a desk drawer, but when he forced it open, he found only a handful of coins from Greece, Norway, and Malaysia. Cooper placed the file he'd got from Control on a low coffee table and read. The first dozen pages were filled with information about Bo Zhang, North Star's target in Macau. Cooper read it all and filed away names, locations, and numbers in case they turned out to be useful. But he had faith in Control's assessment that the disappearance was unlikely to be linked to the Chinese businessman. Several pages were taken up with information about the size, capabilities, and weaknesses of Zhang's security detail. And more set out Zhang's own personal vulnerabilities: a fondness for prostitutes, a red-hot temper, an out-of-control drinking habit, and, of course, a gambling addiction. At the very back of the file was a single sheet of paper with information about the operative assigned to eliminate Zhang. Control had already sketched in North Star's background in the Finnish military, which, Cooper now read, included multiple tours of duty along the country's 1,300-mile Russian border. His psychiatric scores were off the charts for any normal person, but nothing remarkable for a group operative. A colour photograph was useful. Strong-looking shoulders, startlingly blue eyes, and blonde hair cut in a short military style. His performance on previous operations had been summarised as professional, effective, and ruthless, and he'd shown an excellent self-critical streak when evaluating how he could have performed even better. Despite this positive evaluation, Cooper could see how it had been a big step forward for Control to entrust him with the operation. His previous jobs had been on European soil: a long-distance shot at a target in a jeep, and another requiring him to attach a mine to the bottom of a vehicle parked outside a foreign embassy. Both jobs had their challenges, but they were entry-level. Cooper could have executed both with his eyes shut. On its own, there was nothing strange about Control's decision. There came a point in every fledgling operative's career when they had to be pushed out of the nest. Cooper remembered his early months in the group, when he had been entrusted only with gathering operational intelligence, op-int, against targets whose files were passed to others to action. His blooding had come mid-job with the news that the parameters had changed, and now the execution of the target was down to him. If anyone had reviewed that file, he reflected, they would have reached the same conclusion that Control had made in this case. An inexperienced operative had been given more than he could handle. Except that Cooper had done what he was asked to do. He'd cut the throat of a terrorist financier with a serrated blade and watched him bleed out on the floor of his office in Tangiers. In North Star's case, he'd been captured. Not good. Cooper turned to the hotel in Macau where it had happened. That was another aspect of the operation that was bothering him. Only a rookie would think that an environment like that, a high-profile hotel and casino in Macau of all places, would be a good operating environment. Casinos traded in such astronomical sums of money that the amount they invested in security was huge. They'd have cameras everywhere, and that would just be the start. If North Star's legend was that he was just another gambler, the casino would have been able to check that in seconds against the records of hundreds of other casinos around the world. Stepping into a modern casino like that was like stepping under a microscope. It was the last place Cooper would ever choose to pull off a hit. An idea came to him. Control had said the security manager was a former Australian spook. The casino was one of the 3 largest in Macau, meaning that it would have put the best mitigations in place. There was no way that they knew nothing about what had happened. If it was crazy of North Star to attempt to hit there, and it was equally crazy for the team who grabbed him to do it in a place like that. The security manager might say he did not know what had happened, but that was because he had no reason to look closely. He'd want this wrapped up and forgotten as quickly as possible. Cooper knew someone who could help. He'd worked with a good ASIO man years ago when he had been at MI6. He took out his phone and dialed a number. Chapter 4. The hesitation in Lucas Kelly's voice was audible.
I'm only talking to you because of Bobby, he said. He said you can be trusted, and that's good enough for me, but let's stick to the subject and get on with it, shall we? I've got a hotel and casino that needs my urgent attention.
Cooper had once worked with Bobby Williams on an operation against a terrorist network that targeted Australian tourists across Asia. Not every intelligence operation produced clear-cut results, but that British-Australian collaboration had saved many hundreds of lives, leading to the Australian officer receiving a medal from the Prime Minister. Cooper liked Bobby, and had once stayed with him and his family on their ranch outside Queensland. Thank you, Mr. Kelly. I know you've already shared information about the events of last week, and we appreciate the help very much. I also know that what happened is a big deal for you, and I'm keen to find ways we can work together to ensure that the people behind it are put out of action so we can all safely return to business as usual.
Bloody hell, mate. Is that the line you're spinning? I used to be a spook, so I know the playbook. Don't give me any crap about making the world a safer place. You want to catch the guys who did this and kill them, and that's fine with me. Let's not go all Mother Teresa about it.
Cooper chuckled. Then we're both on the same page. Tell me what you've got.
The photographs.
Apart from them. Something useful.
Diddly squat. We have made zero progress in identifying the blokes who grabbed your man, mainly because we don't know what we're looking for. Even if you assume that they're all male and aged between 20 and 40, that leaves us with over 1,000 candidates. I'm happy to send their names to you if you think you stand a better chance of spotting them than we do.
You've interviewed hotel and casino staff?
Nothing came of it. The men were professional. They didn't stand out. No one remembers seeing anything out of the ordinary.
I was told you were looking at the kitchens for exfiltration.
Well, that's the one area we've made some progress. A kitchen porter told us he'd told a man in a bar about the layout of the hotel and the security measures around deliveries. He even drew a map. Bit of money changed hands, but it's safe to say he understands it was the wrong thing to do. There's a door that's used by so many delivery personnel and staff that I'd expect half the bloody island knows the code. The cameras show a vehicle arriving shortly after your man was grabbed and leaving soon afterwards. Logo on the side suggests it was a company delivering seafood, but it's not a company we've ever dealt with.
What else?
What else? Asked Kelly. Is that not enough for you, mate?
You said you wanted me to be direct. I know how places like yours are run. I know you collect a lot more than CCTV.
I've told you everything we've got.
No, you haven't. Come on. You want this to go away so you can get back to making money. You don't care about Philippe Montreux. I don't blame you. Why would you? And you don't care about the team that snatched him other than making sure they don't do it again. You're looking at this the wrong way around. I'm doing you a favour. I'll find them and pass on the message that operating on your territory comes at a price. Now, I'll ask again. What else have you got? It was Kelly's turn to chuckle.
You've got nerve. I'll give you that.
He was silent for a moment or two as he worked out what he could get away with saying.
All right, we've got something else. 10 seconds of audio product from one of the elevators. The three men travelled up to Montreux's floor together. The reason I didn't mention the facts that we've got a bug in the elevator was that the quality is poor and it's inconclusive.
Cooper let that pass. He knew the real reason Kelly hadn't mentioned the bug was that he wouldn't want it to get out that the hotel monitored its own guests to that extent. What language is it?
English, but with an accent. It's impossible to pin down a nationality from it.
Can you send it to me?
As a favour to Bobby. Okay. Email?
Cooper gave him a safe address.
I'll send it later.
Chapter 5. Cooper was always surprised by the contrast between Ziggy Penn's attitude to his surroundings and his attitude to his work. When it came to computers and data, Ziggy was methodical and precise. There was nothing he hated more than a loose end. But, somehow, that same neat mind blanked over the unwashed dishes in the kitchen sink and the pile of dirty laundry in the corner of his living room.
You're lucky to catch me,
said Ziggy, leading Cooper into his living room.
I can give you about minutes. Make yourself comfortable.
Cooper looked around for a stretch of sofa that wasn't covered with magazines, game consoles, or empty pizza boxes. I'll stand, thanks. I've some audio product that needs cleaning. Ziggy took the USB stick from Cooper and sat down at his desk.
Seriously, sit down or something. There's nothing I hate more than people standing at my shoulder when I'm trying to work.
Cooper chuckled. When he'd first met Ziggy on an operation in Cairo, he'd been struck by how out of place and uncomfortable he seemed on firm business. The passage of time had given him more confidence, it seemed. Now he felt perfectly happy to order operatives like Cooper around. Cooper's mobile rang. He left Ziggy to his work and walked to the window. William?
Charlie, how are you?
Very well, said Cooper. Thanks for calling back. I need some up-to-date advice. William Zuckerman had worked alongside Cooper in MI6 before leaving to set up a risk consultancy specializing in South Asia. In an overpopulated and growing sector, Zuckerman had cornered the market in discreet, unflashy, incisive and accurate business intelligence by using exactly the same range of techniques he had learned as a spy. There had even been rumours, denied strenuously, that he'd poached high-performing agents from SIX and put them to work stealing insider secrets for 10 times the money they could make as Crown servants.
5 minutes before I need to speak to a little bird in the US,
said Zuckerman.
Fire away. Where are we talking?
Macau.
Awful place.
Other than the Chinese, Who'd have the nerve and capability to operate there? Zuckerman exhaled loudly.
It'll be a short list, I can tell you that. When you say operate, what exactly do you mean?
A kidnapping.
A very short list. How much more can you tell me?
That's it, I'm afraid.
Let me think aloud then, and you tell me if I'm off track. There's 2 layers of analysis to apply to this. The first is capability. Who has the resources, personnel, and expertise to pull it off? You're probably talking about a small team of up to 5 people, including a watcher and someone to manage the exfiltration. They'd have to get out of Macau by boat, evading the Chinese Navy and the Coast Guard. To understand the lay of the land, they'd probably have to get some level of technical access. I know you can't tell me this, but given it's Macau, there's a fair chance it happened in a casino, so I'd expect the party responsible to have hacked into the casino security systems pretty comprehensively. To do all that, you'd have to be looking at one of the big countries, USA, UK, France, Russia. They could all do it. Australia too. Canada has limited expertise in this region, so I'd rule them out. Macau was Portuguese, but there's no way they could do this.
It's not the UK.
Didn't think it would be. The second layer is political risk and appetite.
Your speciality.
It'd have to be someone who wouldn't care what the Chinese would do if the op went belly up. I don't think the Australians would have the nerve, to be honest. They've been treading carefully around Chinese interests in recent months. The US have several diplomatic initiatives underway that are bearing fruit, and my hunch is that they'd be wary of jeopardizing that with a snatch job in Macau.
Which leaves France and Russia. Ziggy looked up from his computer and waved to Cooper. "Give me 1 second," said Cooper into the phone. Ziggy took his headphones off.
"I've cleaned up the audio. It's piss-poor quality, but there are a few words that are just about audible."
He pressed a button. There was a buzzing sound, as though the bug had been installed too close to a piece of machinery. In the background was an indistinct murmur of conversation.
"You'll never clean that," said Ziggy, "but listen to this part."
A person on the recording coughed and then said something that ended with the word York. There was another indistinct murmur of conversation.
"Did you hear that?"
"No," said Cooper. He played it back. Cooper leaned low to the speaker. "July? Did he say July?"
"He said 18 July.
Cooper straightened up and unmuted the phone. "I just listened to a piece of audio from a bug. Poor quality, but we caught York and 18 and July. What do you think?"
"Easy,"
he said.
"The next UN General Assembly meeting's on the 18th of July in New York."
Chapter 6. Cooper took his assessment to control and found he had reached exactly the same conclusion. In terms of capabilities, there are very few countries that could pull off a job of this complexity. And in terms of risk appetite, there are even fewer countries who would dare try something like this in China's backyard. When you apply those 2 filters, you're basically left with one country. Russia.
What about a private outfit?
With state backing, maybe. But you'd still need the protective umbrella of a powerful country to pull this off.
Where does that leave us?
I got hold of a piece of audio recording from one of the hotel lifts. Cooper said. One of the men who took North Star was picked up making a reference to New York, and another one mentioned the 18th of July.
The next General Assembly?
Yes, sir. I've spoken to a few old Foreign Office contacts, and the Russian delegation has requested time to discuss something of concern to them. When other parties objected to the short notice, the Russians invoked Code Blue.
The protocol allowing countries to raise issues urgently?
Yes, sir.
Anything else?
Not yet.
Shit.
Control glanced at his desk calendar.
It's the 5th today. We have got less than 2 weeks.
He bit down on his lip.
You want to know the worst case scenario?
It is the Russians, and they're planning to out North Star as a group operative. How much confidence do you have in your analysis?
50-50. We might have misunderstood the audio. The date might refer to something else entirely. We can't say for certain that the Russians were involved, but we have no other leads. There were no suspicious vessels sighted around Macau immediately after the operation, and a contact in the International Aviation Authority has been looking into private flights, but nothing there is out of the ordinary. The only other option is that the people behind this took him by land into China.
GCHQ don't think the Chinese were involved. Very unlikely.
Control stood up and crossed the room to stand before the window. Sir, I'd like to go undercover in New York. I'm familiar with the UN, so blending in won't be a problem. The gossip in the UN is crazy. Even if it's another country, not the Russians, and even if whatever they've got in mind doesn't involve the UN, there's a chance someone knows about it.
2 things before you go, 11.
Sir?
1, the clock is ticking. If the UN is a red herring, I want to know quickly so that we can redirect you somewhere else.
Yes, sir.
2, I don't want you to be under any illusions here. Your mission is to rescue North Star. Failing that, if it's not possible, you are to kill him. We cannot allow the Russians or anyone else to use anyone linked to the group as a way of bringing this organization down. A corpse will be useless to them. Understood?
Cooper nodded. Understood. Part 2. Chapter 7. It had been the same ever since Cooper was a boy. The first time he could remember it happening was when a gang of older boys from the neighbouring housing estate cornered him on his walk home from school. They pushed him against a brick wall, and one of them grabbed his school bag, spilling his books to the ground. The ringleader laughed, kicking a science textbook into a patch of stinging nettles.
You're not allowed to walk down here. This is our territory. Only way you're allowed through here is if you pay us a toll.
Cooper had heard rumours about a gang of boys doing something like this to his classmates. The thought of it hadn't put him off walking home from school each day. If anything, it had made him curious. When he imagined the encounter, lying in his bed at night, he didn't experience fear, just excitement at the thought of what it would feel like to be confronted and challenged, and at the thought of what he might do in response. Even at that young age, Cooper sensed that there was an unusual aspect to his personality, something he hadn't yet tapped into, but which made him different from the people around him. The ringleader might have been an idiot, but he could read a total absence of fear in Cooper's expression. And he didn't like that.
Did you hear me, you little prick? He said, putting his face up close to Cooper's. Empty your pockets or we'll kick your head in.
Cooper fought an impulse to laugh. At that point in his young life, he had never put on a pair of boxing gloves or been taught how to throw an opponent to the mat. All he had was instinct and a sense that it would be to his advantage to throw the first punch, which he did. He could still remember what it felt like to make contact with the boy's nose and how the other boys gasped and stepped back. None of them had expected Cooper, half a foot shorter and a year younger, to do anything like that. Blood poured from the older boy's nose, staining his white school shirt.
You little shit!
He shouted, swinging wildly for Cooper's face. Cooper felt alive in that moment, but there was no surge of adrenaline to make him panic or lose his nerve. He felt an icy calm, as though time itself had slowed to a crawl. He dropped his head, allowing the boy's fist to crash into the brick wall behind him, and drove his knee up into the bully's groin. A gentle nudge was all it took to send him toppling into the nettles. Being underestimated can be useful, he thought to himself as he walked home, quietly humming a tune he'd heard on the radio. He learned 2 things about himself that day. The first was that there was something in his character that made people underestimate him. It was a quality he could control and therefore exploit. When he did so, he could come across as dynamic and full of character, but, just as easily, Cooper could flick an internal switch, blend into the background, and become the grey man. People just didn't notice him, and that was usually to their cost. Because the second thing he'd learned was that it wasn't just that he enjoyed violence, it was that he was good at it. Very good. Cooper flicked the internal switch as he walked down the corridor, preparing to become the kind of man he knew would be overlooked. The head of the British delegation to the United Nations headquarters in New York was a tall, lean and weary-looking man called Sir Norman Axelrod. "Remind me," he said, "what's this about?" Axelrod looked up from his desk long enough to cast an appraising glance at Cooper, who stood at the window, evidently captivated by the views of the East River. He held his shoulders slumped, as though weighed down by the stresses and anxieties of a tiring life, and clasped his hands behind his back in deference to the seniority of the man in front of him. He'd combed his brown hair flat that morning with a neat parting and put on a pair of cheap glasses he'd bought from a pharmacy. "Filing, sir." Cooper kept his voice quiet and monotone. "London found an error in the code used to classify and categorise documents, and we're visiting local offices to rectify the issue. We'll ensure the bugs have been removed and the system is operating smoothly." Cooper could see it took Axelrod only a second or two to write him off as unimportant, which was precisely what Cooper had intended. It'll be the first time anyone's ever described New York as a local office," he muttered, his eyes dropping to the stack of papers in front of him. He waved a dismissive hand and sighed. "Get on with it then." Cooper returned to his desk in the corner of the room. It was this aptitude to fly beneath the radar that had earned him his nickname in the group. The Chameleon. If he'd remained at 6 and played the promotions game, he would now most likely be approaching a similar grade to Axelrod. Yet, he could still also pass as a lowly IT drone as effortlessly as if he had shrugged on a new suit. Cooper sat at his desk and logged into the network. Each national delegation to the UN was given a suite of offices. The United Kingdom's position as a permanent member of the Security Council meant this one was larger and better positioned than most others, with incredible views over Manhattan. Cooper had arranged for his cover role as an IT clerk through a Foreign Office contact in London, but it came with the price that Cooper would actually have to do some work on behalf of the Foreign Office's technical department in order to keep the cover alive. He was halfway through a routine debug of the server when he noticed a portly, dishevelled man losing his temper with the photocopier a few feet away.
"This bloody thing,"
muttered the man, clenching his fist as though to give the stubborn machine a whack, but then thinking better of it. "Can I help?" asked Cooper from his desk.
"That would be very kind of you. This is a bit of a daily habit for me."
He smiled widely to reveal a row of crooked teeth.
"Make coffee, check emails, lose temper with photocopier."
Cooper leaned down to check on a flashing fault light on the photocopier's side panel. He opened the tray and pulled out a sheet of paper that had got tangled in the mechanism.
"I'm tempted to put it down to British decline,"
the man said with a quick smile.
"But the truth is that everyone in this building complains about something. Apparently the French can't adjust the temperature of their rooms, so it's practically a sauna. And a friend of mine who translates for the Saudis says they have rented additional office space in another building because they're so overcrowded."
He stuck out a hand. "Terry Dunlop," Cooper said.
"Henry Faulkner, economic advisor."
Faulkner's shirt was untucked, and his thinning, curly hair was badly in need of a comb.
"What do you do?"
"IT support, just a flying visit."
"How long?"
10 days at most," said Cooper. "Depends how quickly I get this problem fixed. Then I'm off to do the same thing in Vienna."
"I can introduce you to some of the Austrians here if you like. Get some tips on where to stay in Vienna."
Cooper smiled and nodded. Faulkner had already mentioned the French, the Saudis and the Austrians and was clearly well connected within the building. His open, gregarious demeanour said he'd be a natural at making friends. For Cooper, everything came down to whether or not he could turn it to his advantage, and having a gossipy colleague who could point him in the right direction could prove very useful indeed. "That's very kind of you," he said, deciding to probe Faulkner's contacts a little further. "Last time they stuck me in an airport hotel. Awful. I don't want to go there again. And then I'm off to Moscow after that for the first time. I'm terrified about where they'll put me there."
Tell you what, Terry, I'll take you down to the restaurant at lunchtime and point you towards some people who can help. There's some mingling between nationalities, of course, but countries stick together. The Germans in one corner, the Nigerians in another. Everyone has their own territory. I'll show you the lay of the land. You don't want to go anywhere near the higher-ups. Far too suspicious and self-important to talk to strangers. But the normal people at the lower levels couldn't be friendlier.
Chapter 8. It didn't take Cooper long to zero in on a young woman named Irina who worked in the Russian delegation. She hadn't been one of those Henry Faulkner pointed out over their long, lively and gossipy lunch, but Cooper had spotted her sitting at the edge of a table occupied by a large group of Russian UN staff. The group had been dominated by a dark-haired man with a neatly trimmed beard who waved his arms about while talking and clearly enjoyed the attention he was receiving from the young women at his table. Cooper half recognised him, but he struggled to recall who the man was. He pushed the thought to the back of his mind. He wasn't what Cooper was looking for anyway. He didn't want someone senior, self-confident and authoritative. He wanted someone like Irina, who was tired and withdrawn, someone whose posture and body language suggested defeat. When you were looking to recruit an agent, Cooper had learned in 6, someone on the way down was far more likely to say yes than someone on the way up. Another thing he spotted was that her security pass, like his, had the word temporary stamped across the bottom. That might mean that she'd been seconded into the delegation to fill a gap caused by sickness or to help with an unexpected surge in work. Either way, there was a reasonable chance that she would have been put in the same Holiday Inn as Cooper. It was located a few blocks from the UN headquarters and was known unofficially among diplomats as the dormitory, since its relatively cheap rates and convenient location made it the top choice for short-term staff. Later that evening, Cooper sat in the lobby for just under an hour before he saw her walking off the street. He allowed her to enter an empty lift before he got up and jogged towards the closing doors, waving a hand at her. She pressed the button to hold the doors for him. "Thank you," he said. "I thought I was going to have to walk up to the 15th floor." She smiled back. Her dark hair was gathered tightly with a red hairband, and in the artificial light of the lift, she looked pale and gaunt. Cooper noticed that beneath her thin raincoat, she was still wearing her UN lanyard. Cooper took his own lanyard and pass from his pocket. "Snap," he said. "We work in the same place." "This hotel is full of UN staff," she said in a strong Russian accent. "The ones who don't get fancy apartments." "It must be because it's so close." "No," she said with a smile. "It is because it is cheap." Cooper noticed a dark bruise at the base of her neck when she turned her head to check the floor. "It's my first night here," he said. "Can you recommend anywhere to get a bite of food?" "My favorite place is a Cajun restaurant called Southern Soul, 6 or 7 blocks down. If you don't mind a little spice, their jambalaya is amazing." The lift pinged and the doors slid open at Cooper's floor. He stepped out into the hallway. "I'm Terry," he said quickly to her as the doors were closing. "Irina," the woman called out with a smile. Cooper stayed in his room long enough to do a quick bodyweight workout, shower, and change out of his suit into jeans and a sweatshirt. He headed down to the street to find a vantage point. There were plenty of options in a city like New York. He finally settled on a sports bar with a floor-to-ceiling window on the second floor that provided a panoramic view of the street below, including the front entrance of the hotel. It was a full hour before Irina emerged, her hair recently washed and dressed in jeans and a baggy red sweatshirt. A loose scarf covered the bruise on her neck. Cooper left a half-finished draft beer and fell into step 30 paces behind her, allowing the busy Manhattan streets to act as cover. His initial read had been that she was a diplomat, and probably a junior one rather than an intelligence officer. It was hard to be sure, but Cooper had spent enough time with spooks to develop a sixth sense. Everything he was seeing now confirmed his original hunch. Irina walked with her arms folded across her chest and her eyes fixed on the pavement before her. She didn't take natural opportunities to look around her and log the physical descriptions of her fellow pedestrians, something any trained operative would have done without thinking. It soon became obvious she was heading to the same restaurant she had recommended, which allowed Cooper to fall back further. It wouldn't have changed Cooper's plan if she'd gone to a different restaurant, but this way was certainly neater. He watched her push the door open and then waited for a full 20 minutes before entering himself, asking the first waiter he saw if he could order takeaway. Once he had placed his order, he took a seat at the bar and ordered a beer. The mirror behind the bar allowed him to see Irina sitting alone at a corner table set for one. He turned on his bar stool and waved at her. When she waved back, he went over to her. "I promise I won't hold you responsible, but I've taken your advice and ordered a takeaway jambalaya." "Just make sure you have a jug of water nearby," she said. "It is very spicy." "Do you mind if I sit down?" he said. "They said it would be another 5 minutes." She hesitated and then nodded at the chair opposite her. Cooper knew that all Russian UN staff, even those who had nothing to do with intelligence work, would have been briefed to suspect contact with strangers. He hoped that the fact she'd recommended this restaurant would make it feel less of a coincidence that he had turned up here. "How long have you been here in New York?" he asked. "About a month," she said. "Another 2 weeks to go, and then I'm heading back to Moscow." Cooper took out his phone and placed it on the table near to Irina's. Although it looked like any mobile phone, it had been amended by the Group 2 technicians to run a program that could remotely extract data from any other phone in the immediate vicinity. It needed to be close, they'd said. Only a handspan from your phone to the target phone, otherwise it wouldn't work. The other limitation they repeatedly emphasized was that if Cooper's phone was successful in making a connection, the target phone's screen would light up to show that something was happening. "May I?" he said, picking up her menu. He perused the list as though reconsidering his choice, and then placed it back on the table, covering the screen of her phone. Cooper heard footsteps behind him, and then a low voice. "Who is your friend?" Cooper turned to see the same man who had dominated Irina's lunch table in the UN building. His neat, dark beard contrasted with his pale skin, and the dark half-moons beneath his blue eyes gave him a menacing appearance. "I'm Terry," said Cooper, standing to offer his hand. The man ignored him, continuing to look at Irina. Cooper sat back down. He just needed to buy a moment or two of time for the software to complete its extraction of data from Irina's mobile. "I asked you a question," the man repeated, his eyes boring into Irina's. She replied rapidly in Russian. "Don't be rude to your new friend. Maybe he can speak Russian." "He's staying in the same hotel as me," she said, anxiety audible in her voice, anxiety and fear. "Irina recommended the jambalaya, so I thought I'd try it out," said Cooper. "I've ordered a takeaway, so I'm not staying." He glanced at his phone. The software would make a beep as though the phone had received a new message when it had finished its covert work.
"Irina is friendly, isn't she?"
said the man at Cooper's elbow, his eyes still on the woman. He was slurring, and his breath smelled of alcohol. Cooper's phone beeped. Job done. He put it into his pocket and stood. The man placed a hand on Cooper's shoulder and pressed down.
I don't want to interrupt your intimate dinner.
It wasn't hard to guess where the bruise on Irina's neck had come from. Cooper nodded to Irina and smiled.
I'll go,
he said quietly.
You won't go anywhere,
said the man, increasing the downward pressure on Cooper's shoulder and turning to look at him for the first time.
We're just getting to know each other.
Cooper dipped his shoulder suddenly, and the man lost his balance, taking a quick half-step forward to right himself. By the time he had regained his footing, Cooper was already standing. The man looked equally surprised and confused at what had just happened. "Have a good evening," said Cooper. He walked towards the door, turning at the last moment to see the man leaning over Irina and speaking so angrily that spittle flew from his mouth. Chapter 9. Cooper pushed through the doors and stepped onto the street. Just before he'd boarded the flight to New York, Control had called him to ask whether he should put in a formal request to MI6 for access to their files on Russian personnel in New York. Cooper knew from experience that such a request would be pointless. Six would fight the request tooth and nail, using every resource at their disposal to avoid sharing their secrets. It wouldn't make any difference that the group was ostensibly on the same side, working to the same set of objectives. Spies didn't share their hard-won insights unless they had no other choice. Control had told him it was his call to make. If Cooper had an ace up his sleeve, it was the fact that he'd spent all those years as a traditional spy before transferring to the group. One thing that outsiders didn't appreciate about spies and intelligence agencies was that, in some ways, they were like normal employees working in normal companies. Spies were ambitious. They wanted to earn a good living, provide for their families, win promotions, and get the most prestigious postings in the best cities, and nowhere was considered as good as New York. That meant a Russian spy posted to the UN headquarters would have had to earn their spurs in operations around the world before they'd be trusted with the post, increasing the likelihood that someone like Cooper would recognize them. Cooper hurried back to his hotel room. It took a few minutes for the program on his phone to transfer Irina's stolen data to his laptop. He watched as text messages, emails, browsing history, and photographs poured onto the screen. He was struggling to place Irina's friend, but when he navigated to the cache of messages, he immediately spotted a name that helped the pieces fall into place. Pyotr Sokolov. The 12 most recent messages were all from him, demanding to know where Irina was and why she wasn't answering her phone. That explained his anger when he turned up at the restaurant. Sokolov thought she was with another man. Cooper was sure he'd never met Sokolov face-to-face, but he recalled seeing a widely circulated file about Russian atrocities in Chechnya that had Sokolov's name all over it. He'd been attached to a special forces team conducting counterinsurgency operations around Grozny. The report, which was later shared with the International Criminal Court, claimed he was personally implicated in multiple instances of torture, extrajudicial killing, and rape. He'd been clean-shaven then, 15 years younger and 15 pounds lighter. But the menacing, hooded glare hadn't changed with the passage of time. Cooper scrolled through the hundreds of messages between Sokolov and Irina. It traced the contours of a relationship clearly in the middle of a bitter disintegration into recrimination, anger, and cruelty. All the negativity coming from Sokolov. Irina had sent him message after message, pleading with him to allow her some space to think. But every time he responded with accusations of infidelity. Messages between them became increasingly terse, even angry, as Sokolov accused Irina again and again of having another lover. Nothing she said made any difference. Most recently, A darker note entered their correspondence as he apologized for hitting her and she tried to tell him to stay away from her. Cooper saw the same thing when he navigated to her photographs. Cooper isolated all the pictures of them together. In his own way, the album of their photos told the same story of their downward spiraling relationship, from happy days on safari in Kenya to pictures in which Irina looked strained and exhausted. He found pictures she'd taken of bruises and split lips, evidence of Sokolov's violence that she'd recorded but never used. He needed to find actionable intelligence. Tracking back 1 month, to when Irina said she'd first arrived in New York, Cooper found a message in which Sokolov demanded she come to see him. She'd insisted that she hadn't wanted to be sent to New York and just wanted to keep her head down and work. But he told her he'd pulled strings to have her sent here. "I did this for you," he wrote. "For us. The least you can do is come to see me." His next text included his address. Bingo. If there was one person in New York who'd know about North Star and what was planned for the General Assembly, it was Sokolov. Cooper had his first target. Chapter 10. "I'm fascinated by the United Nations," said Cooper. "It's like a miniature of the entire world in one building. You must feel that you've got the best job in the world, Henry."
It's definitely the most interesting posting of my career,
said Faulkner, wiping ketchup from his chin with a paper napkin. They were seated on a bench in St. Vartan Park, a short walk south of the UN headquarters. They could glimpse the 39 stories of the main Secretariat building, its blue-green tinted windows glinting in the sunshine. Pigeons milled around their feet, and now and then Faulkner would lob them a fry to fight over.
But it's also the most frustrating place until you learn to adjust your expectations. You can make progress, but everything moves at a glacial pace.
I wish I were going to be here for the meeting on the 18th. It would be incredible to see it all coming together.
The most interesting things at those meetings always happen in the margins. That's where the deals are struck, where the diplomats roll up their sleeves and get down to the nitty-gritty. The stuff in the chamber is just for show.
3 teenagers on skateboards came racing through the park, scattering the birds. Cooper eyed Faulkner. "What's on the agenda for the meeting?"
It's pretty vanilla, to be honest. Global poverty and the usual arguments about Israel and Palestine. The Russians have requested a slot on the agenda, but no one knows yet what that's about. The British are going to be preoccupied with trade. Ever since Brexit, the word from London is that we've got to be driving forward discussions about trade with the Southern Hemisphere.
Cooper nodded thoughtfully. As well as thinking carefully about how he could develop his contact with Irina, Cooper was determined to exploit Faulkner's diplomatic access to find out as much as he could about the Russian plans for the 18th, now only 10 days away. If his worst fears were right, and they intended to expose North Star and the group to the world, Russian diplomats would know the plan and be involved in carrying it out. The spies might pull strings behind the scenes, but it would be the diplomats who stood front and centre, and that was Faulkner's territory. "I read something about the Russians tabling a motion about NATO expansion," said Cooper. He'd read nothing of the kind, but he wanted to give Faulkner a chance to correct him.
Faulkner snorted and shook his head. Whoever said that doesn't know what they're talking about. It won't be anything to do with NATO. But they're being tight-lipped about whatever it is, that's for sure. We know it's related to security, at least in the broader sense, because the Russians have invoked a code blue to force the issue onto the agenda at short notice.
What's the significance of that?
We'll find out on the 18th. It's unusual, because code blue is supposed to relate to global security. You're supposed to share details of the issue immediately so other states can take steps to protect themselves. Keeping it secret until the last minute like this is strange. A friend of mine in the Georgian delegation thinks it'll be directed at us, though. Russia is aggressive, and they like to grandstand. The US is obviously their principal antagonist, but the US is so powerful that the Russians often prefer to aim their attacks against us.
What could they attack us about?
That's the million-dollar question. They usually recycle the same old talking points, but for them to request time on the agenda like this must mean that they have something new to say. Otherwise, they'll end up looking stupid. I've even heard rumours that Lavrov is flying in.
And no one will know anything right until the moment it happens?
Well,
said Faulkner, lowering his voice and looking around.
That's certainly what the Russians hope will happen. But the thing about a place like the UN is that it's very hard to keep anything secret. For now, they're doing a pretty good job of keeping a lid on it. But with every day that passes, that will get harder.
What do you mean?
This is how it works. There's a ton of preparation that goes into these big events. Slides, documents to write and distribute, accommodation and security for visitors. The list goes on and on. You might keep a secret to a small group for a while, but you need dozens and dozens of people to run something big like this. Now, those people might not know the entire story, but they will know pieces. And if someone like me collects all those pieces...
Cooper sat back. And once you've collected all those pieces, you'll be able to work out what's going to happen. He crumpled his burger wrapper into a ball and threw it into the nearest bin, then turned to Faulkner as though an idea had just occurred to him. Will you tell me what you find out? I'm interested. Faulkner crumpled up his own wrapper and threw it at the same rubbish bin. It sailed over the top, landing in a flower bed. He turned to Cooper with a grin.
If you keep buying me burgers, I'll tell you whatever you want to know.
Chapter 11. Cooper watched the entrance to the tall New York apartment block where Pyotr Sokolov lived. The big Russian had left 35 minutes earlier to walk to the UN building, as he did every single morning. But Cooper didn't want him. He was waiting for 83-year-old Maisie Smith, a long-time resident of the building who shuffled 3 blocks every morning to buy a bag of groceries and a copy of the New York Times before returning to her apartment 3 floors below Sokolov's. When she finally appeared, it was on the arm of the building's concierge, a fierce, old-school New Yorker in a smart red jacket with gold buttons who guarded his building as though it were Fort Knox. 2 days earlier, Cooper had watched as the concierge threw out an opportunistic thief pretending to deliver parcels. Cooper could see it would be difficult to blag or charm his way into the building. He would need a cast-iron reason to be there. Cooper set off after Maisie, following her from the other side of the road as she traced her usual route. When she finally reached the grocery store, he let her disappear inside while he took up position in a nearby bus stop. On the previous 2 mornings, Cooper had followed her into the store, striking up a conversation with her and helping her reach items on the higher shelves. He quickly discovered that she was lonely after her husband's death the year before and happy to find someone to speak to. On this morning, when Maisie finally emerged, Cooper was ready. "Good morning, Maisie," he called out. "How are you today?"
Very well, thank you,
she said. She wagged an admonishing finger.
You weren't there to help me reach the granola this morning.
Well then, I better carry your groceries home for you.
I can't take you out of your way,
she said, although he could see that she wanted the company. Not at all. I'm going to visit my sister this morning. She just moved into the old Goldman apartment block.
That's where I live,
exclaimed Maisie, turning to Cooper with a look of amazement. That's amazing. We can go there together. It took them over 10 minutes to cover the short distance because of how Maisie stopped every block to point out an old feature of the neighborhood and tell Cooper its history. When they approached the door to the apartment, Cooper made sure he was in the middle of telling her a long story about his own family history, which meant that they sailed through the lobby and past the concierge's desk with no comment at all. Once Cooper had safely delivered Maisie and her groceries to her apartment door, he located the emergency stairwell and climbed the 3 floors to where Sokolov lived. He opened his shoulder bag and took out a flat grey box the size of a paperback novel. A switch on the side activated the jamming device that Group 2 had supplied. Cooper knew Sokolov's apartment would be fitted with the usual array of security equipment used by Russian diplomats all over the world. He had seen the same gear used in dozens of other locations. But the Russian reliance on their own state-developed kit meant it was the same wherever you went around the world, which made it easy to design and manufacture a device that would work in New York just as well as in London, Paris and Buenos Aires. Cooper waited for the small light on the unit to flick from red to green and knelt to examine the lock. He could see immediately that it was expensive and designed with several additional security features intended to frustrate burglars. The hardened steel would be hard to drill through, and he could see several false gates, deceptive notches intended to confuse those trying to pick it. Most residential locks had 4 or 5 pin stacks, but Cooper could see 7 spring-loaded pins inside the chamber. Cooper set to work. His instructor in 6 had once timed him opening a standard lock in under 30 seconds, a record for his intake. The additional security features on Sokolov's door added an extra 2 minutes. He stepped inside and eased the door shut. The clock was running. The security devices concealed in Sokolov's apartment, cameras, infrared sensors, traps, would not pick up on his presence, but a fault in the security system would have registered with the head of security in the Russian delegation, and someone would be sent to investigate. He stepped into the living room. It was decorated in a smart, minimalist style, with modern art on the whitewashed walls. Cooper crossed to a desk and knelt to open the single drawer. He didn't know what he was looking for, but had always found that simply being in his opponent's space was a useful way of getting inside their head. The drawer was filled with a handful of leaflets about tourist activities in the New York area, including guided walking tours. There were ticket stubs from the Empire State Building and from Broadway shows. Sokolov had a bundle of rubles and a roll of dollars in 20s and 50s. A bookshelf, nestled in an alcove, held a small collection of Russian-language novels. Off to one side was a galley kitchen. Cooper didn't waste any time there and went into the single bedroom. Floor-to-ceiling tinted windows showed spectacular views of Central Park. The bedside table was empty except for a mixture of Russian and American coins. The floors had recently been vacuumed and the surfaces wiped clean of dust. The wardrobe held 8 suits, 6 of them still wrapped in their dry cleaners' plastic covers. The pockets of the other 2 were empty. Cooper had expected nothing less of someone with Sokolov's experience. Every intelligence agency had rigorous protocols for the handling of classified material, and all files and sensitive paperwork would need to remain at all times in the secure environment of the delegation's strong room. He returned to the living room and the desk drawer. Among the bundle of tourist leaflets was a map. Cooper spread it out on the desk. It showed the entirety of Long Island, which lay directly east of Manhattan, with a separate inset focusing on the Hamptons, the exclusive area at the tip of the island where wealthy New Yorkers spent their summers. Cooper leaned in closer. He could see faint imprint markings, as though someone had circled areas or streets in pencil and then rubbed out their work. His train of thought was disturbed by a noise in the corridor outside. He crossed quickly to the front door and looked through the fisheye, catching a flash of red from the concierge's coat as he strode down the corridor. Cooper waited. Having completed his inspection, the concierge returned to Sokolov's front door.
"There's no sign of anything in the corridor outside,"
he said into a mobile pressed to his ear. He turned to look at the door and bent to inspect the lock.
"The lock hasn't been tampered with,"
The person on the other end clearly didn't accept his assessment.
Hey, look, buddy,
said the concierge.
I was a beat cop for 30 years. I know what a break-in looks like. There are no scratches on the metal, no dust on the floor from a drill, no sign that the door has been damaged. I understand your alarm says there's a fault, but I'm telling you, it doesn't look as though that fault is caused by an intruder. There's been no suspicious characters downstairs at the front entrance, just residents and their guests. Anyone delivering a package has to leave it with me. Now, if you'll allow me, I've got to get back down to the front door where I'm supposed to be.
He listened again.
No, buddy, I am not going to stand here until your man gets here. I have done my job.
He hung up, muttering,
"Goddamn Russians,"
underneath his breath. Cooper waited until he heard the ping of the lift opening and closing and let himself out. Chapter 12. Cooper finally found Irina on the roof of the Holiday Inn hotel where they were both staying. He'd watched her return from work at the usual time and had sat in a bar across the road for several hours, nursing the same glass of beer, waiting for her to emerge. As darkness fell, it seemed clear that she wasn't going out that evening. When he called up to her room from the hotel lobby intending to hang up if she answered, the phone just rang and rang. He checked the basement gym, the restaurant and the bar before going to the top floor. The heavy service door to the roof space was unlocked and creaked loudly as he pushed it open. He immediately saw Irina standing by the low wall at the edge smoking a cigarette. She heard the noise of the door and turned to see who it was, fear and alarm etched onto her face. She couldn't hide her sense of relief that it wasn't Sokolov, but that didn't mean she wanted company. "I'm not in the mood for conversation," she said to Cooper as he crossed the roof towards her. "Neither am I. I was wondering if I can have one of your cigarettes." A faint smile on her lips, she handed Cooper the packet. "I haven't smoked one of these for years," he said, lighting the cigarette. "But a shitty day calls for something." She glanced across at him. "You too?" she asked. He waved a dismissive hand. "It's just office politics. I'm sure the same things happen in every delegation." They smoked in silence for a while. They were facing eastwards and watched as tugboats and ferries drifted lazily down the East River. Cooper could see the Gothic arches of the Brooklyn Bridge and beneath them the steady march of pedestrians the size of ants. "How did you like the jambalaya?" she asked. "You were right about needing a jug of water," he said. "I think next time I might ask them to dial down the heat a little." He took a hip flask from his jacket pocket. "I'll swap you a shot of whiskey for another cigarette," he said. She nodded. The lid of his hip flask was also a small metal tumbler. He poured a generous measure of Livre and handed it to her. It was time to show his hand. "I can see you've been having a hard time." She looked at him. "When I saw you before, there was a bruise on your neck. Now there's a bruise on your arm. I can see the finger marks. It was clear from the way he behaved in the restaurant that he's a bully." She looked away from him, gazing out towards the horizon. "Is there anything I can do to help?" He watched as several emotions played across Irina's face. Anger at Cooper for intruding upon a private matter, shame at what had happened to her, fear at what Sokolov might do if he found out that she'd opened up to a stranger. There was never a perfect moment to launch into these tough conversations. In fact, there was always some reason or another to put it off until another time. But Cooper had spent the previous evening doing a thorough analysis into the contents of Irina's phone, learning that both of her parents had died the previous year within 3 months of each other, and her only sibling, a brother she didn't get on well with, was working for a tech firm in Geneva. Her ties to Russia had been weakened. She'd probably spent her whole life in the diplomatic service, thinking that she would return home one day and spend the rest of her life there. But, with her parents dead, her brother in Europe, and her lover on the warpath, There wouldn't be a better moment than this to suggest that she had more options than she knew.
I don't know what to do,
she said quietly.
He never used to be like this, but he's so jealous that he has got 2 men following me in case I meet someone else.
Is there anyone at work you can talk to about this? She laughed at the idea.
He's important. There's no way they will believe me rather than him.
And if you return to Russia?
It will be worse. Here, at least, he has to be discreet in the ways he controls me. He can't behave in the way he wants until we are behind closed doors. Then he can do whatever he wants. But when I am back on Russian soil, it will be 10 times worse. I am sure of that. There, he can do whatever he likes.
Do you want a way out? She pulled back in surprise, her eyes roaming over every inch of his face.
I have been to so many security briefings over the years, she said. They said that this happens to every Russian official at some point in their career. A Western spy will approach you and offer you the world. It might be money, it might be a visa, it might be a passport. But you must not believe them. They are liars.
She shook her head.
I have to say, Terry, or whatever your name is, I really didn't have you down as a spy.
I'm not going to bullshit you. It's a ruthless game. We don't make the offer of help until you need it most. It sounds to me you're in that place right now. She shook her head.
I don't believe you. I have heard the stories about the wild promises. $1 million, a fast car, a comfortable retirement in London or Washington. But then, the moment you have what you want, you will throw me to one side and I will be in a worse position than before.
Those are lies told by Moscow to persuade you to say no. That's not how we work. We treat people in your position with care and respect.
You do lie, though. You're not denying that.
Cooper was listening as carefully to what Irina wasn't saying as what she was. She wasn't saying that she didn't want or need his help. She wasn't saying that she would never dream of betraying her country. She was saying, although not in so many words, that she wanted Cooper to prove himself before she would accept his offer. That was halfway to a yes. I'm telling you the truth, he said.
Really?
She said, sarcasm dripping from her voice.
That's what they all say.
I operate on a strict quid pro quo basis. I do something for you, you do something for me. If anyone is at risk of being cheated, it's me. You can take what I am offering and walk away, doing nothing in return.
And what is it exactly that you are offering?
Something small. As a gesture of good faith, something to prove to you I am what I say.
I want nothing from you. Accepting something would mean that I have put myself in a position of risk. If my colleagues found out, I would go to prison for the rest of my life.
You said that Pyotr Sokolov is having you followed by 2 of his men. Her eyes narrowed at the mention of Sokolov. She hadn't used his name, so it was the first small sign Cooper was the real deal.
Yes, night and day. Wherever I go, they are there. So what?
Pick one of them.
Excuse me?
Pick one of the 2 men, the one you dislike more. She frowned, uncertain where this could be going. Finally, she shrugged.
One time, I tried to get away from them by running for a subway train, but they chased me and boarded the same train. This bruise on my arm, this isn't from Piotr. It's from one of his men, the big one, with breath like rotten fish and a scar above his left eye. He grabbed me tightly and said that if I tried that again, he would break my nose.
Okay, said Cooper, flicking his cigarette over the edge. I'll take care of him for you. Chapter 13. Even in a city like New York, teeming with every nationality, Yevgeny Karpov looked to fish out of water. It was partly his height and build that made him stand out from the crowd, in a literal sense, but also his lumbering gait and the permanent scowl on his pale, doughy face. Stepping out of the UN headquarters, he squinted at the evening sun just beginning to dip below the horizon. His suit was at least one size too small for his broad shoulders, and anyone looking closely would have seen that his socks were different shades of blue. Before moving to New York, he'd spent hours practicing tie knots, not that you would have known it from the messy tangle just beneath his collar. He wrenched the tie off and stuffed it into his jacket pocket. Grand Central Station was a few blocks away. The pavements in Manhattan could be crowded with tourists and shoppers, but people got out of Yevgeny's way when they saw him coming. It was partly his size, but also the long, curled scar above his left eye, a souvenir from an encounter with a fellow inmate during one of his many stints in military prison. That was when he was younger and struggled to control his temper. Over the years, his superior officers had thrashed into him the need for self-discipline and self-control. And now he was over 30, he looked back on those wild, youthful days with something like nostalgia. These days, his job was mostly to look intimidating. 9 times out of 10, that was enough to get the job done. He stepped into the street without waiting for the light at the pedestrian crossing to turn green, prompting a volley of angry horns. The driver of the nearest yellow cab leaned out of his window to give Yevgeny a piece of his mind, but took one look at the lumbering giant and kept his thoughts to himself. Yevgeny had once thought there could be nothing more mind-numbingly boring than a shift on sentry duty in a watchtower. Now he was required to spend entire days standing outside closed doors in a suit. He was revising that opinion. It turned out that the UN headquarters building was so well protected by the NYPD and the UN's own internal security team that there was little left for security staff like Yevgeny to do. He'd expected to be knocking heads together regularly, but the most exciting thing that had happened since his arrival in New York 2 months earlier was being asked by Sokolov to follow his troublesome girlfriend around. Given how little action Yevgeny had seen, it was no wonder that he'd taken the first opportunity to grab her tightly by the arm with his enormous fist, cutting off the blood in order to scare the life out of her. She didn't know it, but she was lucky they'd been in a public place. If they'd been out of sight or back in Moscow, he'd have given her a slap for trying to get away from him like that. He strode into the central terminal hall of Grand Central Station, oblivious to the stunning, vast blue-green ceiling covered with paintings of constellations and stars. With one eye on the departure board, Yevgeny hurried with minutes to spare to the platform where he knew a train waited that would carry him to Queens. This was his one night off in the week, and he was determined to enjoy it. If he had more time, he would have headed further afield, to Brighton Beach in Brooklyn, nicknamed Little Odessa on account of the number of Russians found there. Yevgeny was sensitive enough about his English that he found it difficult to relax when surrounded by New Yorkers who frowned at his thick accent and asked him to repeat himself. Queens wasn't as good as Little Odessa, but it had its share of Russians, and it was closer, which was what counted when he had limited time at his disposal. He tried his best to improve his English before moving here. For someone of his limited educational background, a posting in New York was almost unheard of. He had fully expected to be sent as a guard to one of the penal colonies in Siberia. The one ace he had up his sleeve was that long ago, on a military tour of Chechnya, he'd saved the life of a Russian intelligence officer named Pyotr Sokolov. He'd largely forgotten about it. But when he questioned the orders to move to New York, expecting to hear that someone had made a mistake, he was told that it had come about at the request of Sokolov himself. He was repaying the debt. The train to Queens took just over an hour, during which Yevgeny started drinking vodka discreetly from a bottle hidden inside a brown paper bag. From the station, he headed directly to his favourite watering hole, a no-frills bar called Uncle Joe's, run by a distant friend of his cousin from St. Petersburg. He settled onto his usual bar stool, the one as far away as possible from the window, and set about drinking the best part of a bottle of vodka while talking with Josef himself about women, ice hockey, their mothers, and the things they missed about Mother Russia. From there, Yevgeny headed to a massage parlour away from the main street, where the woman at the front desk spoke enough Russian for him to describe what he wanted. He was happier when he emerged a half-hour later, ready to return to Manhattan and face another week at work. The one thing he missed was a good fight. That was one reason he'd first come to Queens. He'd heard that local tough guys might pick a fight with him, but everyone he'd seen had crossed the road to avoid him. It turned out that everything he'd heard about New York came from the 80s. That was when it had been wild and dangerous, with addicts roaming the streets and shootings every night. He would have loved to experience that. These days, the city was like one giant theme park. He looked at his watch. He'd have to hurry to catch his train. He took a sharp right down an alleyway that ran behind the main street, crowded with bars and restaurants. Up ahead were the dark, hulking shapes of metal bins lining the walls. It was as he was passing the first of these that the man struck. The blow wasn't that hard, at least compared to what he'd experienced in his past, but it seemed to land on a cluster of nerves somewhere between his shoulder and his neck, causing sharp pains to shoot down his arm. Yevgeny felt his balance go and leaned against the wall, his head spinning. The next blow was a jab to one of his kidneys. Again, it seemed to inflict more damage than he would have expected, as though the person attacking him knew more about his body and how it worked than he did. He shook his head to clear the pain and wheeled around, lashing out with a heavy arm to keep his attacker at bay for long enough that he could fight back. But there was no one there. He wheeled around again, looking behind him, and turned his face into a boot that cracked his nose, sending a stream of blood and snot pouring down his shirt front. His attacker set to work with a cold, efficient fury. Blows rained down, each one directed at a specific part of Yevgeny's body, causing him to cry out in pain and curl up to defend himself. More than anything, he wanted to get up and fight back, but this man, whoever he was, fought with a ruthless precision that he'd never encountered before. He felt the man's boot crack at least 2 of his fingers before landing in his stomach, breaking a rib. He swung wildly into the darkness, aware he hadn't even got a good look at his assailant. But even when the man moved in front of him, his blurred vision made it hard for him to focus. The man was white, he was sure of that, but beyond that, he couldn't be sure what he looked like. A kick to his left knee sent him toppling to the ground for the last time. To Yevgeny, it felt as though it would never end, even though the most savage and thorough beating he'd received in his life lasted for less than a minute. Chapter 14. Cooper completed his second lap of Central Park and turned off the busy running track onto an empty patch of grass. He did some stretches, allowing his breathing to return to normal. Taking out his mobile, he dialed a number he'd memorized long ago, listening to a series of clicks as the call was routed and rerouted across continents. Global Logistics, how may I direct your call? It's Terry Dunlop. I'm calling with an update on the New York shipment. Please stay on the line. Most diplomats and spies working inside the United Nations building would conduct sensitive conversations and phone calls in what was called a safe speech room, which was routinely swept for bugs and clad with a special material that would frustrate microphones. There was a perfectly good safe speech room in the UK delegation, but as a lowly IT technician like Terry Dunlop would have no reason to use it, Cooper had waited until the end of the working day to make the call.
11.
So,
Status update.
clear. I'm free to speak. The other advantage to Cooper's early evening run was that it had allowed him to confirm he wasn't being followed. He'd started off slowly, but by the second lap was moving at a speed that no surveillance team would have been able to match. His long career meant that he'd encountered plenty of foreign intelligence operatives, And every time he walked into the UN staff restaurant or entered a lift, he was braced for the possibility he would be recognised. Anyone who recognised him would see through the Dunlop cover in seconds. It was also possible that Pyotr Sokolov had put him under surveillance as a rival for Irina's affections. "I'm developing 2 lines of attack into the Russian delegation at the UN," he said. "The first is through a British diplomat, Henry Faulkner, very well connected within the organisation. He's reporting back to me on any gossip he comes across that is connected to the Russians. The second is through a junior diplomat called Irina Peskova. She's in an unhappy romantic relationship with an SVR intelligence officer called Pyotr Sokolov." Sokolov? Why do I know that name? There was interest in him a decade ago after allegations about what he did in Chechnya. He was involved in some nasty stuff. He became much more high profile than he would have liked, and so has spent much of the last decade keeping his head down. The International Criminal Court considered charging him. Correct. I've gained access to his apartment and will task Peskova to search his files inside the delegation. You've won her round quickly. Are you sure she can be trusted? Cooper watched as a group of rollerbladers dressed in various neon colours streamed along the path in front of him. She's in a desperate position. Sokolov is having her followed by 2 of his men. She's terrified that if she returns to Russia, the harassment will step up to the next level. She wants a way out, and I've been able to make a gesture showing her I'm acting in good faith. What kind of gesture? She was worried I'd take what I wanted and abandon her, so I told her I'd do something for her up front. One of Sokolov's men had been a little rough with her, so I returned the favour. It happened far away from here in Queens, so it's unlikely anyone will connect it to his work or even the UN. He didn't get a good look at me at any stage, and I took his wallet to make it look like a mugging. It'll send Irina a signal that I've got what it takes to help her out. Good start, 11. But we still don't know where North Star is. Or who holds him. I have an update on that. The Australians followed up on our behalf with the hotel manager. He allowed them to swab for DNA in the lift where they got the recording. And they got a match on a mercenary for the Wagner group who just got back from Africa. Enormously experienced, very capable. So we're right to be looking at the Russians. Yes. But I'm still not sure that we should look in New York. For what it's worth, sir, I have a feeling that something is happening here. Faulkner says he's never seen the backstage manoeuvrings that are currently underway. There's something behind the Russians' decision to use a code blue. I think I should stay here and bottom this out. Control was quiet. Cooper knew not to hurry him. I'll give you some leeway, 11, but I want a lot more than a hunch next time. I want proof that North Star is there, and I want you to have a plan to either get him out or eliminate him. Understood. And time's marching on. Don't let it run out. Chapter 15. Cooper smiled patiently. Let me talk you through the steps again. He'd been impressed by Irina's steeliness. Over the years, he had recruited dozens of sources, including many highly placed officials in the governments of countries where executions for treachery were routine. In almost every case, Cooper had been required to coax the individual through a period of doubt in which they faced up to the reality of what he was asking them to do. If I get caught, they'd say, I'll be dead within hours. I must think of my family, of my children. Cooper nodded sympathetically and set about walking them through all the many factors that had led them to this point in their lives. Even though he almost always persuaded them to betray their countries, it was invariably a long and drawn-out process. But Irina was different. She knew she was crossing a line. She knew her employers, the Russian state, would pursue and punish anyone they judged to be a traitor without a shred of mercy, wherever they were. But when Cooper pushed open the heavy metal doors to the roof of their hotel, she turned to look at him with a broad smile on her face. When he said he wanted her to plant a tracking device on Sokolov's car, she said she would immediately. But first, she wanted to hear every detail about Cooper's encounter with Karpov. What noises did he make? Cooper had never been asked that before. All the noises you would expect from someone being beaten up. Did he cry? Cooper couldn't help but smile. Irina, come on. I want to hear what it was like to do that to him. It was over quickly. I took him by surprise and probably hit him no more than a dozen times. He's a big man, but he's slow and out of shape. He's used to scaring people, but the darkness and the surprise threw him off. She sat back, nodding and smiling as she imagined the scene. There were people who needed to be reminded constantly of the reasons that they'd agreed to betray their country. But Irina wasn't like that. She didn't need any reminders or reassurance. She'd decided this was what she needed to do, and that was the end of that. The brakes were off. Will you do the same to Piotr? Let's take this one step at a time, he said. In the distance, a tugboat on the East River sounded its horn. Cooper held out an open palm, cupped slightly to protect the object he held from the breeze. In the centre of his hand was a small disc the diameter of a fingernail. Its edges were rough and uneven, and the surface was a dark mottled grey. She leaned in to examine it. This is a tracking device? She said, the incredulity audible in her voice. Yes, it's magnetic, so it will stick to the chassis. Put it anywhere near the underside of Sokolov's car, and it will look like any other piece of debris thrown up off the road. Brilliant, she said, but there is a problem. We never really use his car. In a city like New York, either we walk or he has one of the security team from a delegation drive us. Cooper nodded. In situations like this, the agent, in this case Irina herself, was best placed to come up with a solution. After all, she was the one who would have to do it, and she best understood her own abilities and the constraints she would work under. He didn't have to wait for long. I know, she said excitedly. I will tell him I have booked a romantic dinner for us, somewhere far enough away that we will need a car. But if I tell him I want to make things right with him, he won't want someone else there with us. Are you sure he won't just book a cab? They don't trust cabs. They think they're all controlled by the FBI. She took the tracking device from Cooper and touched it carefully with her fingertips. So I just stick this to the outside of the car? She asked. Her brow furrowed as she thought through the steps that would be required. He always opens the door for me when I get in, so I'll have to wait until we arrive at the restaurant. I'll get out before he has time to come round and open my door. And if he sees you doing it? He will not. But if he does, insisted Cooper, I deny it. Say it could have been put there at any time. Say you saw one of the security staff under his car and assumed they were fixing something. Her eyes lit up. If that happens, she said, I will say I saw Yevgeny hanging around his car before he was attacked. You see, already they are suspicious. Pyotr himself said to me it makes no sense why someone would attack Yevgeny. I suggested Yevgeny may be involved in something criminal, something he's keeping secret. Cooper chuckled. Remind me never to get on the wrong side of you, he said. She smiled back. And then? I will arrange the dinner for tonight and put this on his car. What are we doing after that? One step at a time. Don't get ahead of yourself and don't get complacent. I don't need to tell you he's a cruel and dangerous man. And he will not be a simple man to fool. He's paranoid and clever. Focus all your attention on this task. She rolled her eyes. Trust me. It'll be like a walk in Central Park. Chapter 16. Cooper followed Henry Faulkner along the row of seats, edging his way past spectators who stood to let them past.
Here, said Faulkner. Not a bad view at all.
He grunted, panting, as he lowered his considerable size into his narrow plastic fold-down seat. In one arm, he held a bag of crisps. In the other hand, a plastic cup of beer that he'd already splashed onto his trousers. You're going to have to explain everything to me, said Cooper, settling into the seat next to Faulkner. I know baseball isn't cricket, but I don't know a huge amount more than that.
You'll pick the rules up.
Their visit to watch the New York Yankees play the LA Dodgers was all part of Cooper's strategy to create an unspoken sense of obligation in his colleague. He'd started off by buying Faulkner lunch each day, and then invited him one evening on a cruise around the Statue of Liberty. Now, it was a pair of sought-after tickets to a Yankees baseball game at their stadium in the Bronx. As long as Cooper didn't go too far and make it seem he had an unspoken agenda, he hoped Faulkner would express his gratitude by continuing to share all the rumours, gossip and diplomatic tittle-tattle he picked up.
Who did you say you got these tickets from?
My aunt, said Cooper. Belated birthday present.
You'll have to pass on my thanks. The last time I came here, my seat was so far back that I needed a pair of binoculars to see the action.
In the row in front of them, an entire family was dressed in the Yankees' distinctive navy blue and white uniforms. Along with the rest of the crowd, they rose to their feet for the national anthem. Faulkner cursed under his breath, having just settled into his seat, but also stood. On the green field beneath them, a man dressed as a cowboy walked out across the field towards a small stage and microphone. Who's he? Said Cooper.
He's the star of a very successful Broadway show. I took my mother to see it when she visited last year.
An orchestra struck up the familiar sound of the US national anthem, and the rich baritone of the Broadway star filled the vast stadium. After they were seated again, and Faulkner had flagged down a passing hot dog vendor, they settled in to watch the game. Faulkner kept up a steady stream of commentary, filling Cooper in on the team's scandals and gossip as much as the rules of the game. The Yankees were the stronger team, and soon 3 of the Dodgers players were out.
Each inning has 2 halves. The first half is called the top when the visitors bat, and the second half is the bottom when the home team takes their turn.
How many innings are there?
9.
One of the Yankees' new signings took to the field and immediately scored a home run, prompting huge celebrations from the family in front of them. Once they had settled down, Cooper lowered his voice and leaned towards Faulkner. I meant to ask, Cooper said casually, as though the thought had just occurred to him. Have you heard any more gossip about the assembly meeting? Does anyone know what the Russians are up to with the code blue? Faulkner leaned towards Cooper, but kept his eyes on the field.
Not a dicky bird, he said. It's been totally quiet. In fact, I wonder whether they've called it off, whatever they had planned. It happens from time to time.
Cooper nodded thoughtfully. He had always been sceptical of Faulkner's insistence that it was impossible to keep a secret in a place like the UN. If Cooper was right, if the Russians planned to expose the group to the world, they'd take exceptional measures to ensure there were no leaks. He decided to needle Faulkner a little and see what he could find. Maybe your contacts are better at keeping secrets than you thought, he said. Faulkner ignored him, but Cooper saw his eyes narrowed a little as he absorbed the implied criticism. I suppose we'll both have to wait until the 18th of July to find out, said Cooper.
Hang on a minute,
said Faulkner, unable to accept the implication that there were secrets he couldn't uncover.
I'm not saying that something is happening but I can't find out what it is. I'm saying that nothing is happening. I'm sure of it. I play table tennis once a week with my counterpart in the Russian delegation. He told me the most exciting thing happening is an application for a new property to be added to the list of official diplomatic premises, which is about as routine and dull as it gets.
What does that involve?
You're allowed a certain number of properties that are registered as official premises and covered by diplomatic immunity. Nobody can enter them effectively. Typically, it's an embassy or a consulate building, but it might also be a diplomat's house or even a holiday home. The Russians have a ski chalet in Aspen, for example.
And they want to add a new one to the list.
That's what I heard. Completely routine. You can blame the Russians for plenty of things, but you can't blame them for wanting a place in the Hamptons. Been there?
Never.
Incredibly beautiful. I only wish we had a place there too, but it's probably beyond our budget.
The bat of a Yankees player cracked like a bullet as he made contact with the baseball. Faulkner leapt to his feet along with everyone else around them to cheer. The familiar opening bars of New York, New York sounded over the stadium speakers. Cooper let Faulkner's comment hang in the air. He remembered the map he had found in Sokolov's apartment and how certain streets in the Hamptons had been circled and then rubbed out. What intrigued him was that it would be highly unusual for someone in Sokolov's position to be involved in the purchase of a new property unless the real purpose of that property was connected to Sokolov's work. Then it would make perfect sense. Faulkner nudged him.
Time for another beer?
Chapter 17. Cooper was in the Holiday Inn having breakfast when it happened. Irina entered the busy dining room and made a beeline for his table. "I think you dropped this on the floor outside," she said, placing a newspaper on the table and smiling. Cooper nodded his thanks, taking the paper and returning to his eggs, saying nothing in return. He kept his eyes down as Irina walked to the buffet table, filling a plate before taking a seat at her own table in the corner. Despite keeping a calm expression on his face, Cooper was horrified by what she'd just done. They should never be seen with each other in public, given that she had agreed to act as his agent within the Russian mission. He could only imagine that Irina thought she was being clever and discreet by concealing a message for him inside the newspaper. But to have approached Cooper in front of so many people was a serious error of judgment. Her cover story didn't even make sense. Cooper had arrived in the dining room 20 minutes before her, so how could she possibly have spotted him dropping a newspaper in the lobby? He had seen the same thing happen with other agents and cursed himself for not warning Irina against it. Sometimes people became so intoxicated by the idea that they had joined the world of spies that they imagined they had to act in ways they'd only ever seen on the cinema screen. He remembered an agent of his in Colombia who had gone to such lengths to spot a surveillance team that wasn't there, doubling back on himself and hiding behind corners, that a passing police officer thought he was a burglar and promptly arrested him. Irina clearly thought that she'd disguised the fact that she wanted to pass him a message, but anyone in the dining room with an ounce of training would have spotted it for what it was. The only thing he could do at this stage was keep his behaviour normal. He finished his omelette, drank a second cup of coffee, and returned at a leisurely pace to his room, the newspaper folded under his arm. Once behind the closed door, he opened the paper to find a message scribbled at the bottom of the second page. "Meet me on the roof." Cooper took the stairs to avoid bumping into anyone in the lift. He heard voices in the top floor corridor and waited for them to pass before he stepped out. Irina turned at the sound of the heavy door creaking open, a triumphant smile on her face. "Irina," Cooper said, "I can't stress this enough. You can't act like that. It isn't safe." She frowned. She'd expected praise for her ingenuity, not criticism. "I thought it was a good idea. I still think it's a good idea. It was just a newspaper." "We were in full view of lots of people. It's my fault. I should have put a measure in place for you to trigger an emergency meeting. Just promise me you won't do something like that again." "You are too cautious," she said. "It will be fine." "I just wanted to tell you I put the tracking device on Piotr's car last night." She grinned. "I was brilliant. You should have seen me. I did it when I was getting out of the car, when Piotr was still around the other side talking to the valet. Even I couldn't see the device. It looked like any other piece of dirt.
There's no way Piotr saw anything.
Cooper already knew she'd been successful. The tracking device was set to self-activate once it came into contact with the metal surface. He had watched as the car was taken by the valet to a parking lot near the restaurant and then driven back to Sokolov's apartment at the end of the evening. "You did really well," he said. Although he needed to bring her back down to earth and remind her about the need for safety and caution, he also needed to keep her motivated. "I can tell you're a natural." Although it was a gift to someone like Cooper that Irina had thrown herself so wholeheartedly into her new role, there was a real risk that she would jeopardize the entire operation by behaving recklessly. That was the downside of the speed at which this had all happened. Normally, Cooper had to encourage his sources to step up and deliver. In Irina's case, it would be the opposite. He'd need to remind her where the brakes were. "I have been thinking," she said. "When this is all over, I wish to be resettled in America. I know you are British, but I am sure you can arrange this. I know how wet it can get in England, and I want to live somewhere that doesn't remind me of Russia. I'm thinking maybe Los Angeles or San Francisco. Can you do this?" "Slow down. We've only just got started. There's nothing to be gained by rushing into this too fast. That's how mistakes are made." "You are wrong. There is no time. Piotr told me last night he has arranged for me to be sent back to Russia in 1 week." Cooper couldn't hide his surprise. "I thought you had another month of your posting here." "So did I. I told him I wanted to make our relationship work, and the best way to do that was for me to remain here with him. It will be like a honeymoon, I told him. But his mind is made up. He didn't believe you wanted to give your relationship another chance." She turned her face to the view, breathing deeply of the breeze as she struggled to keep her emotions under control. He said, "He is skeptical when people change their minds as I have done. However, he will give me the benefit of the doubt, but we will try to work things out in Moscow. He says there are too many distractions here." She turned back to Cooper, her eyes flashing with emotion. "You have dangled this other life in front of me, a life free of monsters like him, a life where I will be free to live how I wish." There were tears in her eyes. "I'll get you what you want. I will get you everything. Then you will give me the life I want. You mentioned before that you wanted me to search Piotr's office. Wait!" He put a restraining hand on her forearm. "I don't want you to rush into anything. It's too dangerous. You don't understand. This is my one chance. I will bring you what you want, and then you will give me what I want, what you have promised. A new life. That is our deal. Do not let me down." She tore her arm away from him and ran for the door. Chapter 18. She'd planned it meticulously, or at least that was what she thought. A quick glance through the diaries of Piotr and his closest colleagues had confirmed they had no plans to visit the office that day. That wasn't unusual. Intelligence operatives were considered a law unto themselves, with the knowledge they did their most important work far away from the limelight. The earliest that any member of the Russian delegation would leave work was at 6. From then until 8, there would be a steady trickle of departing staff. Irina herself had complained loudly throughout the day about a report that her masters in the Kremlin had demanded she submit the following day, requiring a late shift at her desk. No one was surprised when the clock passed 10 and she was still hard at work. The last of her colleagues stopped by her desk just before 11.
"Still working," he said. "I wish they would give you one deadline and stick to it," she said with a smile, stretching her arms up and rolling the stiffness out of her neck and shoulders. "Do you want me to lock up?" "Yes, please. Remember to listen for the double beep. That's the sign that the alarm has been set."
Even when she had the office to herself, she waited. Terry's words about playing it safe rang in her ears. She wanted to show him she could operate both safely and quickly. After another half hour of drafting and redrafting her report, she pushed back her chair and stood up, looking around the room. She could see that at this late hour the lights had been dimmed in the corridor outside. Cameras were positioned in the corners of each room, but she'd been told that these weren't activated until the door was locked and the alarm activated for the night. She did a quick circuit of the room she was in, shaking her arms to work out the tension, and then walked towards the corridor that led to Piotr's office. The corridor took her past several meeting rooms before opening up into a room filled with photocopiers and banks of computers. Irina stood by the window, looking out over a city that glittered like 1,000 jewels. This had been her first proper visit to New York. She'd passed through the city many times on her way somewhere else, but she'd never stopped to experience its unique energy. In its own way, she reflected, the city had played its part in pushing her to cross the line and agree to help the British. Whatever you thought you knew about New York from books and movies, nothing could prepare you for its energy, diversity, and vitality. She felt infused by the city's headlong spirit. New York had reminded her that there was a rich life to be had as long as she could get away from Piotr. She turned away from the window and walked directly to the door to Piotr's office. She stopped briefly to consider that at this moment she still had plausible deniability. She could claim that she was doing one last tour of the office to check everything was locked before going home. A thought flickered across her mind. Was this crazy? But the reality of the life she could expect if she returned to Moscow flashed before her eyes. Even if she managed to get away from Piotr, which was far from certain, he'd ensure her career was over. There would be no more promotions, no more postings to exotic, far-flung capitals. At best, she'd be sent to Tashkent or Dushanbe. More realistically, she'd be dispatched to see her days out in some far-flung corner of Russia, administering the budget of a tiny, unimportant district she'd never heard of. That was the real choice. A miserable life in Russia or freedom. It was no choice at all. Easing the handle down, she stepped into Piotr's office. It was as bare and austere as his apartment. The whitewashed walls were empty, and even the wastepaper basket in the corner had been wiped clean. She tried to open the first drawer, but it was locked, as were the second and the third. She cursed under her breath. Hurrying back to her own desk, she grabbed a pair of scissors and returned to Sokolov's office. She jammed the blade into the lock, twisting until she heard something snap. A part of her brain registered the fact that she was leaving behind a trail that could be discovered. But she didn't care. She was so preoccupied by the prospect of returning to Russia that she ignored the alarm bells ringing in her own mind. She grabbed the pile of papers from the drawer and spread them on the desk surface. Taking out her mobile phone, she snapped pictures of the pages, stuffing them back into the drawer one by one, with little thought of how it would look. She was in such a hurry that she barely noticed the content of the documents. The lights suddenly went out. She thought of the torch on her phone and fumbled for that, dropping it to the floor. She cursed again, dropping to her knees to feel with her hands for the phone. The lights went back on. She looked up to see Sokolov standing in the doorway, watching her, a smile on his face.
"This doesn't look good,"
he said. Chapter 19. Cooper was about to leave his hotel when he got the call. It was past midnight. He'd spent the entire afternoon pinned to his desk in the British delegation by a tedious cover task while watching discreetly on his phone as the tracking device showed Sokolov's car moving east out of New York toward the Hamptons. It took all his self-discipline to resist the temptation to jump into his car and follow. But Cooper knew hostile foreign intelligence services would have infiltrated the British delegation, and it was imperative he didn't behave in a way that would have made anyone suspicious. He had to behave in a way that would allow him to maintain his cover. He decided to visit the property after dark, after Sokolov had returned to Manhattan. The cover of night would provide him with a better chance of success. He dressed in black and assembled a length of rope, wire cutters, binoculars, and a camera, all stashed in his backpack. But then the phone rang.
"I'm looking for a Mr. Terry Dunlop," said a weary-sounding New York voice.
"Speaking."
"I've got a message from your sister. She wanted me to tell you she's in the Harlem Public Hospital. She wants you to come and see her."
An icy panic gripped Cooper's heart. His sister. He didn't have a sister. It must be Irina. "Is she all right?"
"Not great."
There was a pause.
"I think it's better if you come and see yourself."
Cooper sprinted down the stairs and ran out onto the street, hailing the first cab he saw. Why Harlem Public Hospital? He thought, as the taxi battled traffic along FDR Drive. As an accredited diplomat, Irina would have the best health insurance possible. For her to choose a public hospital, which typically acted as a safety net by treating patients who couldn't afford insurance, must surely mean that she was avoiding using her name. There could only be one reason for that. She was on the run. "An extra $20 if you get me there in the next 15 minutes, he said to his driver. They made it there in 10. Cooper paid the driver and ran across the road, tracking along until he found a one-way street used by ambulances that took him to the back of the hospital. The taxi ride had given him time to think, and he couldn't discount the possibility that Sokolov's men had already tracked Irina down and were at the hospital front desk trying to find out where she was. If that was the case, the last thing he wanted to do was run through the front doors. The hospital's reloading bay was a melee of vehicles, paramedics, cops, and delivery vehicles. He saw a group of workmen carrying tools heading towards the doors and joined their group at the back, keeping his head down until he was safely inside. He assumed Irina would be in the ICU, given the nature of the call, so followed signs to its reception desk. One nurse took him to her bed. She was propped upright, her face so discoloured and swollen that she was almost unrecognisable. A cut across her forehead had been stitched and bandaged. Cooper pulled up a chair and sat down, reaching for her hand. "What happened, Irina?" Her voice was muffled by the swelling around her mouth.
"He caught me searching his desk."
Cooper bit down on all the other things he wanted to say to her. What were you thinking? Didn't you listen to my warnings? Why didn't you take the risk seriously? This wasn't the right time for recrimination. How bad are your injuries?
"Not bad enough to stop me running when I had the chance. He was going to kill me. I could see it in his eyes. He took me down to the garage, but I stuck my fingers in his eyes and ran out onto the street."
Do you think he'll be looking for you?
"Definitely. He and his men."
An argument started at the other end of the ward. Cooper glanced around. There were no private rooms in a hospital like this. The other beds were occupied by the victims of car accidents, domestic abuse, and addiction. The background noise meant he and Irina could speak freely. "Where's your mobile phone?"
"I shoved it down the back of the taxi that brought me here."
Cooper nodded. It wasn't as smart an idea as she thought. The Russians could track the taxi's movements and would see that it had stopped briefly at a public hospital, drawing the obvious conclusion that she'd checked in there. He was glad he hadn't used the front entrance. "That's why you got one of the staff to call me," he said. She nodded. "Have you got anything at all electronic on your person or in your bag, even a key fob from the office or a pass card?"
"No. I left my bag in the office. The only thing I had with me was my phone."
That's good, but we'll need to get you out of here. Give me a few minutes. Cooper dialed a number, listening to the series of clicks as the call raced around the world. He went through the procedure to identify himself and, after a moment, was connected to control.
Report,
he said. The young Russian diplomat who was helping me got caught searching Sokolov's desk. He's beaten her badly.
Alive or dead?
Alive. She got away, but I think they'll have personnel arriving here shortly. We need to get her away to a private hospital under a different name, and from there into permanent relocation and resettlement. Control sighed. How did this happen?
Didn't we have Sokolov under surveillance to ensure he didn't disturb her in the act?
I didn't know she was going to do it, sir.
You didn't know? So she did it entirely of her own volition, without you telling her to do it first? Sounds as though she's not actually our agent, 11. And if she's not our agent, she's not our problem. Sir, if she's not following your instructions, then she's responsible for whatever happens. I warned you this was happening too quickly. It takes time to recruit and train an Agent 11. It simply isn't possible to do it safely in such a short time frame.
Cooper knew that there was truth in what Control was saying. Things had moved too fast, and in that haste, there hadn't been time for some of the essential conversations about how someone in Irina's position should behave in a way that would allow her to remain undetected. Where he disagreed with Control was on the subject of responsibility. It was a foundation stone of this sort of work that responsibility lay with the handler, not with the bewildered civilian talked into betraying their country. Had Irina made a mistake? Undoubtedly. Had she been reckless? Had she charged headlong into a situation she didn't fully understand? Yes. But handlers didn't cut loose their agent because something had gone wrong. I disagree, he said.
It comes down to this, 11. Did you ask her to search Sokolov's desk? If you didn't, she's on her own. If you did, then it's on you. You'll have to answer for this debacle.
Cooper remembered how Irina had left him, determined to do something that would bring Sokolov down. She didn't have the right temperament for this sort of work. He could see that now. But he also knew with certainty he couldn't live with himself if he left her to her fate. If Sokolov got his hands on her, she'd be flown back to Russia and executed.
11?
Yes, sir.
Which is it? Is this your fault or hers?
Mine. I take full responsibility, sir. Control digested the admission. It felt like yesterday that Cooper had defied his explicit orders to travel to Israel to save his half-brother's life, an act of insubordination that had nearly seen Cooper being exiled from the group. The price of readmission had been a promise he would never lie to Control again. Yet here he was, accepting responsibility for something he hadn't done. The only upside, it would be very hard for Control to prove he had lied. The downside, he was admitting to a serious mistake.
There'll be time for us to do a post-mortem on this later. For now, move her to a different hospital. I'll authorize funds to be released to your account to cover the costs.
Thank you, sir.
11. Completely aside from whether you are being fully transparent with me, I hope it hasn't escaped your attention that this will not help us one jot in finding North Star. In fact, it is a distraction, a major distraction. The Russians are doing whatever they're doing tomorrow, and, once again, you're diverting into something that might be laudable, but has nothing whatsoever to do with our core mission, which is, if I need to remind you, the elimination of individuals who pose a threat to this country. Your next call to me had better contain the news that you have located North Star and either rescued him or killed him. Is that clear?
Cooper felt Irina grip his hand tightly. He looked up to see an expression of terror on her face. He turned towards the ward entrance.
11?
2 men stood there, staring at them.
Yes, sir, he said. Understood.
Chapter 20. For someone like Cooper, with years spent honing his instincts, a decision sometimes came to him fully formed with no lengthy assessment or the weighing up of pros and cons. Like now. He removed his hand from Irina's and walked towards the men, nodding a greeting as he approached. He changed his posture, his shoulders slumped and his neck bent forward, and he barely lifted his eyes as though already intimidated by their presence. "Can we talk?" he said. "Not here. Somewhere private." The men looked at each other, barely able to suppress their surprise and amusement that such an unprepossessing man would choose to go anywhere private with them. The older of the two was the decision-maker. His cheeks were covered with a silvery stubble, and his dark blue shirt was open at the neck, revealing several heavy gold chains. His younger colleague was dressed in a black tracksuit, with green stripes running down the sleeves. "There's a stairwell over there," said Cooper, pointing at a door marked Service Personnel Only. The older man nodded and started walking towards the stairwell. It was only now that Cooper was committed that his mind began to trace the contours of his logic. Like every similar facility in America, the Harlem Public Hospital was protected by cops, all of whom were armed. Although Sokolov's men would have diplomatic immunity, they had been sent to resolve what was essentially a private matter. Sokolov's argument with his lover was trivial compared to the many sensitive operations that the Russians were no doubt undertaking in New York. This meant that no one, Sokolov least of all, would wish to escalate the situation. They would want to resolve it discreetly, without the involvement of the armed cops, which was exactly what Cooper had just given them the opportunity to do. Cooper saw the older one lean towards his colleague and murmur in low tones, "We keep it quiet," he said in Russian, in what Cooper recognized as a St. Petersburg accent. "We attract no attention." He pushed the door to the stairwell open to allow his partner to go first. Cooper kicked the younger man hard in the small of his back, sending him through the open door and crashing into the wall. He grabbed the older man by the back of his neck and pulled him through. Cooper pulled the older man's head down hard while simultaneously driving his knee upwards so that the hard edge of his patella cracked into the man's forehead. He lost consciousness and fell to the floor. The younger man pushed himself upright and swung his right elbow towards Cooper's head. Cooper stepped in before the elbow arrived, gripping the man tightly around the chest while hooking his right foot behind the man's ankles and sweeping them from under him. The man fell to the floor with Cooper still locked tightly around him, his grip ensuring the man was unable to use his arms to break the fall. His head cracked on the hard concrete floor. The man moaned, his eyes swiveling in his head, and it took the slightest amount of sustained pressure to his neck to cut off his oxygen. Cooper opened the door a crack to check that the commotion hadn't been witnessed. A trio of paramedics rushed past the door, pushing a patient on a gurney, while a doctor at the other end of the corridor shouted directions to them. There were far more important things occupying people's attention. He waited for the paramedics to pass and then crossed directly to Irina's ward. She had clearly assumed that Sokolov's two men would overpower Cooper and was pulling the drip feed from her arm and climbing out of the bed to get away. Her eyes widened in surprise as she saw Cooper come back on his own. He put her arm across his shoulders and helped her to her feet. "Time to find you another hospital," he said. Chapter 21. It was soon after 2 a.m. when Cooper left Irina in the expert care of a small and extremely expensive private hospital in the East Village. He caught a cab back to his hotel and went straight to the nearby side street where he had parked his rental car. He'd been about to drive to the Hamptons when the call about Irina had first come in, so he had everything he needed already stashed away in the trunk. He drove slowly, taking unnecessary turns with one eye on the rearview mirror to make sure he hadn't picked up a tail somewhere along the way. He understood that his chances of discovering anything useful in the Hamptons were slim. If Sokolov was involved, then the property would be SVR linked. He was convinced of that, but the foreign arm of Russia's intelligence apparatus would have dozens of live operations against American interests running at any one time. The property could easily be linked to one of those. But Cooper had little choice other than to keep working away at the leads, pulling at every thread to see what he could unravel. At that time of night, the roads were increasingly empty, especially as he drove out of Manhattan and hit the Long Island Expressway. The signs passed in a blur: Deer Park, Medford, West Hampton. A sign for Sag Harbor finally appeared out of the gloom, and he swung the wheel, turning off the expressway. As he drove further into residential areas, he slowed his speed. He was driving a smart rental car, a midnight blue BMW that wouldn't look out of place in a neighborhood like this. He'd be much more suspicious on foot than in a vehicle, and so he wanted to get as close as he could to the property before parking. He turned into the street where the property was located. The tracking device was accurate to a distance of 10 feet, but on a residential street, it was possible to get a false reading if the houses were too close to each other. It was also possible that Sokolov had parked his car further down the street, safely away from the property he was visiting. But as Cooper drove slowly down the winding road, it quickly became clear which property the Russians had purchased and why they'd purchased it. The road narrowed and the houses disappeared. On either side were densely wooded patches of land. He wondered whether he'd gone too far, but then the house came into view. Set in a couple of acres of ragged, overgrown lawn, it was large and clad in a weathered timber that gave it a farmhouse look. The lights were off and no curtains hung in the windows. An alarm box clung to the outside of the house, but it looked old and rusted, and Cooper wondered whether it was a shell intended to scare off casual burglars. For sale signs were still in the driveway. He turned the car around and parked further up the street. Returning on foot, he approached the house from an angle in case anyone was watching. He vaulted the white picket fence and stood for a while among the trees at the edge of the property, letting his eyes adjust to the darkness and watching for the slightest sign that the house was occupied. The flower beds lining the outside of the house were filled with weeds. Off to one side was a double garage clad in the same weathered timber. He listened to the distant hum of traffic from the expressway. Nothing had come down the street in all the time he'd been there. Cooper bent to a crouch and hurried across the lawn to the edge of the house. Once again, he stopped and waited for any sign or sound that someone had reacted to his presence. Nothing. He stepped towards a window and looked through into a spacious living room. The walls were whitewashed and empty, and there were no rugs on the wooden floorboards. Cooper circled around to the back door of the house, far from the view of anyone who might walk or drive down the street. Shining his torch through a glass panel in the back door, he checked for any of the telltale signs that the house was alarmed. The quality and condition of the locks was always a good indicator, along with the presence of any small, discreet boxes containing the electronics needed to run a home protection system. Here, the house looked as though it had been unoccupied for a long time, and as though the previous owners had taken their security system with them. There was nothing to show that an alarm would go off, so he took a small ball-peen hammer from his backpack and tapped the glass, the shards tinkling as they hit the tiled floor inside. Reaching through the broken panel, he unlocked the door from the inside. It was always possible that the broken window had triggered an alarm elsewhere, so he hastened through the deserted house, keeping low to avoid creating a profile that could be seen from outside the house. He went from the hallway into the kitchen. The cupboards were bare, and cobwebs cluttered the corners of the room. He walked through the empty living room and dining room before moving into the hallway and climbing the carpeted stairs. At the top, a long corridor stretched away before him. He was pleased to see it was also carpeted, as creaking floorboards were a hazard for someone in his position. He moved quickly, looking into bedroom after bedroom, each with their own large ensuite bathroom. Other than a dripping tap, he found no sign that anyone had been in the house in recent time. It had obviously been cleaned when the previous owners moved out, but from the amount of dust, Cooper thought that might have been a few months earlier. He returned to the hallway and went down the stairs, preparing to leave by the back door. He hadn't known what he might find, but wasn't surprised that he'd drawn a blank. It was likely, he thought, that Sokolov had been involved in selecting the property, and he knew it would be used in Russian intelligence operations at some point. But he resigned himself to the conclusion that it was probably unrelated to North Star and his mission. He'd reached a dead end. He was at the back door when he heard the noise. A scraping sound, like a metal chair leg on a stone floor. He paused, kneeling, until he heard it again. It was difficult to determine where it was coming from, but it wasn't far away. He went into the kitchen. In the corner was what he had assumed was a door to a storeroom. He cursed himself for not having checked. He eased the door open and saw a large pantry with a trap door set into the concrete slabbed floor. He heard the noise again, louder this time. Drawing his weapon, he took hold of the metal ring and eased the trapdoor upwards. A ladder led down into darkness. Taking one rung at a time, Cooper descended, turned around to face the room with the pistol extended. At the bottom, he dropped to one knee and felt packed earth under his feet. He flicked on his torch. He was in a cellar, one side stacked with empty wine racks. In front of him, a crude stone archway led into a second chamber. Cooper saw a figure chained to the wall. Even in the gloom, it was recognisably North Star. His hair was so pale it was almost white, and his skin was drawn tightly over his Nordic features. A gag was tied around his mouth. He blinked repeatedly in the intense glare from the torch. When Cooper dropped the beam, North Star peered into the darkness, his eyes widening in shock as he saw who it was. He pulled at his chains, making the same scraping noise that Cooper had heard from upstairs. Cooper stepped quickly towards him. He had been ready to kill North Star if there was no other choice, as Control had ordered, but he felt relief at the prospect of being able to rescue him instead. When he heard the noise, it was too late. He wheeled around, his firing arm extended, but a heavy metal bar came crashing down on his wrist, sending his cig clattering to the ground. A second blow glanced across his head, sending him sprawling back against the wall. A ceiling light came on. Once his eyes adjusted to the glare, Cooper saw Sokolov standing over him, the iron bar in one hand and a Makarov pistol in the other. Nothing could have prepared Cooper for what came next. North Star slid his hands out of the manacles, removed the gag from his mouth, and stepped forward with a smile on his face. He put one friendly hand on Sokolov's shoulder and turned to Cooper. "What took you so long?" Chapter 22. Cooper felt the rough cellar wall at his back. Blood dripped down his forehead. He put his hands on the floor, preparing to get to his feet, but Sokolov raised the Makarov and pointed it at his forehead.
"Make yourself comfortable on the floor. We have a few hours to wait, but if you get up, I will shoot you. We are 10 feet on the ground. Even if we had neighbors, which we don't, they would hear nothing."
He looked at Cooper and smiled.
"I was surprised when I heard what you did at the hospital. I thought you were just some random guy who wanted to jump into bed with Irina. Then, when I caught her looking through my desk, I thought that something strange was happening. She didn't name you, but it seemed like a lot of coincidences happening at once. We are trained to be suspicious of circumstances, right? People in our line of work."
Cooper looked for a way out. There was none.
"My men tried to downplay what happened. Boss, they said, he got lucky, he took us by surprise. but I recognize the actions of an operative when I see them.
To be honest, you were the last person I thought would be behind it all. You were the last person I thought would be working for Control. Cooper was surprised to hear him reference Control. What's the plan? Asked Cooper, looking from Sokolov to North Star. What are we waiting for? Sokolov smiled, and Cooper realized. It'll be your opportunity to enjoy the limelight, said North Star, speaking for the first time. His English bore the faintest trace of his Scandinavian origins. He was dressed in black jeans and a deep blue roll-neck sweater that contrasted with his pale skin and hair. The clothes were clean, and Cooper cursed himself for not spotting immediately that it wasn't the outfit of someone who had been kept a prisoner for weeks. Sokolov handed the Makarov to North Star and used the ladder to exit the cellar. What do I call you? North Star seems a little formal given the circumstances. Edvin. Control trusted you. He thought you had potential. He'll tear your throat out for betraying him. Edvin smiled and shook his head. He didn't trust me, and I didn't trust him. He won't be surprised when he finds out what's happened. It's the nature of the game. He trusted you to do your job. If he had trusted me a little more, none of this would have been necessary. I asked him about the group, but he wouldn't tell me anything. How many operatives there are, how they are trained, where they are stationed, nothing. If he had told me, that might have been enough. But because he told me nothing, we had to do this. It forced us to make a bolder plan. When did the Russians recruit you? A long time ago. Moscow must have been thrilled when Control picked you out. They must have thought they'd hit the jackpot. Sokolov climbed down the ladder and murmured to Edvin. What's going on? Asked Cooper. Save your breath, said Sokolov. You can do all the talking you want tomorrow. When you parade me in front of the General Assembly. When Sokolov didn't reply, Cooper went on. We thought you'd kidnapped Edvin for that. He laughed and shook his head. But Edvin was just the bait. This was all a trap. If we tell the world about you and your friends without proof, they'll dismiss it as propaganda. You help us make our case. You'll have to tell me what you want me to say tomorrow. What are my lines? Sokolov stepped forward and held out an aerosol can. He sprayed it into Cooper's face. The cool droplets hit his skin, and almost immediately he was overwhelmed by an enormous sense of drowsiness he knew he could not resist. Within seconds, he was unconscious. Chapter 23. It was the sound of Manhattan traffic that jolted Cooper into consciousness. First a volley of car horns, then the deep growling rumble of a truck as it idled at a set of traffic lights. He turned his head to one side, seeing only darkness. He tried to roll over, but discovered that his hands were secured behind his back. There was something hard and metallic immediately above his head, limiting his movement. He rotated his wrists, trying to get a sense of whether he could force his hands free, but he felt a cold, sharp metal edge that said he was handcuffed. At least he could breathe. He smelled exhaust fumes, as well as a cleaning product that had recently been used on the inside of the car trunk where they'd put him. The sensation of being confined to a small space like that took him straight back to his childhood. He had been a studious and well-behaved child, but during one long period when things were bad at home, Cooper had acted up at school, starting fights and talking back to his teachers. He remembered like it was yesterday, the afternoon when his PE teacher had decided he'd had enough and shoved the argumentative 12-year-old Cooper into a storage cupboard, turning the lock.
That'll give you a chance to think about how to speak to your elders, the teacher said, striding away, his words echoing around an empty sports hall.
Cooper was young enough that he didn't know the word claustrophobia. He wasn't knowingly afraid of anything, which meant he was surprised to find his breathing speed up and sweat break out on his skin. The darkness was so complete he couldn't even see his hand in front of his face. He hammered on the door. Nothing. He shouted, but even as he did so, he knew it was futile. The storage cupboard was at the far end of the school. No one would hear him. If he wanted to get out, he'd have to do it himself. He fumbled through the items surrounding him in the cupboard, all the while struggling to fight the panic that threatened to overwhelm him. He forced himself to breathe slowly and slowly felt the panic subside. It was replaced with an icy calm. With one outstretched hand, he found a pile of basketballs. With another, a stack of plastic cones. He searched further. At the very back of the cupboard, his hand found a segment of metal pole that normally supported a volleyball goal. Hefting it to gauge its length and weight, Cooper turned and drove the edge into the door that was all that stood between him and freedom. It rattled. He hit it again and again and again. Even when he heard footsteps and shouting in the sports hall, Cooper kept on driving the metal pole into the door, splintering the wood and forcing the door open gradually until he could see daylight. Even when a group of students called out to him, he kept on hitting the door. "Stop! Stop!" they yelled. "We'll open the door for you." But he didn't want anyone to help him. He wanted to do it himself. With one last drive, he smashed the lock and the door swung open to reveal half a dozen kids staring open-mouthed at the scene of destruction that lay before them. The sound of a New York accent jolted Cooper from his train of thought. He recognized the voice and pressed his ear to the trunk, hoping he would hear it again.
"Go on through, sir,"
he heard. He guessed one of the security guards who manned the exterior of the United Nations building. Cooper shouted and struggled, slamming his knees and elbows and head against the interior of the car trunk to alert the guard to his presence. But whoever was driving the car revved the engine, drowning out his cries. The car jolted forward, swinging into a sharp left turn before plunging steeply downwards. Cooper recognized the angle. He'd come this way many times before into the staff car park beneath the building. Cooper felt the familiar feeling of icy calm coursing through his veins. He was acutely aware of his surroundings. The material lining the car trunk, the smell of disinfectant, the hard edge of the handcuffs. He knew he would have one opportunity to act, and he would have to recognize that opportunity when it appeared and grasp it without hesitation. Click. The trunk opened. Chapter 24. It was strange to be back in the same building where he'd spent so much time over the previous weeks, except this time he was a prisoner. Sokolov pulled a baseball cap low over Cooper's face and draped a long beige Macintosh over his shoulders to conceal the handcuffs that kept his arms secured behind his back. A man Cooper didn't recognize stood to his left, with Sokolov on his right, one arm lightly gripping Cooper's elbow as he led him across the car park floor, up 2 flights of stairs, and down a corridor. Cooper assumed he was still in the cavernous underground section of the building, which had at least 8 floors underground. They passed doors with signs on them. Electrical supply, do not enter, and storage facility 6.334. Cooper had never been down here before. He saw someone approaching them from the other end of the corridor. He kept his head angled downwards, as though he had noticed nothing, while he examined the approaching man. Dressed in the blue overalls of the building staff, he looked like a janitor. As he came into sight, Cooper saw he carried a bucket in his left hand. He wore a pair of headphones, and his head rocked to the beat of something only he could hear. Cooper considered his options. It was clearly a stroke of luck that someone had appeared. The Russians would have chosen this route because it was seldom used, and he could tell from the tension in the way they held themselves that they hadn't counted on encountering a member of the building staff down here. But what could Cooper do? Ask the man to alert someone? Everyone had seen him coming and was braced for Cooper to try something. If required, he knew Sokolov would use whatever level of violence was required to subdue the man. The stakes were just too high. Sokolov angled his body so he blocked the man. Cooper could feel his tension, the way he was braced to act, and then the final exhalation of relief as Cooper let the moment pass, attempting nothing. Cooper hoped he hadn't made a mistake. Being inside the building sharpened his sense of urgency. In a matter of minutes, the Russian foreign minister would step onto the stage in front of hundreds of assembled ambassadors and the world's cameras and declare that Russia had uncovered an assassination program run out of London. Cooper would be the proof. He wondered what else they would use to corroborate what they'd say about him. They turned a corner. Cooper saw a familiar face ahead. Yevgeny Karpov, the man he had attacked and beaten up in Queens. Karpov's face was still bruised, and he stood stiffly. Karpov saw the group approaching him down the corridor and turned to open a door. Sokolov pushed Cooper inside. Chapter 25. The room was windowless and lit by a single fluorescent strip bulb. Cooper could hear traffic roaring somewhere above them. Sokolov held a radio to his ear. Cooper heard a crackle.
5 minutes,
said a voice in Russian. It made sense. Everything would be timed down to the last second. They wouldn't want Cooper hanging around in the UN headquarters for a moment longer than was necessary. Cooper was standing in the middle of a room no larger than a small office. He looked around. Yevgeny Karpov unlocked Cooper's handcuffs and pushed him in his chest, so he was forced to take a step backwards to the far wall. Karpov made a gesture with his hand to show that Cooper should remain there and stepped back himself so that his broad back was pressed against the only door, blocking any thought of an escape. Sokolov stood in the corner of the room. One hand continually flexed, a sign of the tension he felt as the seconds counted down. A small Russian flag pin glittered weakly on the lapel of his dark suit jacket. His radio crackled again.
4 minutes.
Cooper looked at Karpov and smiled. In Russian he said to him, "How are you feeling, my friend?" Karpov narrowed his eyes. "I'm impressed that you're back at work so soon. You're more resilient than I thought. I thought you'd be out of action for weeks." He smiled. "I don't think you landed a single punch of your own." Sokolov gave a hard look at Karpov and then made a slicing gesture with the edge of his hand to indicate that Cooper should stay quiet. Cooper ignored him. "I've seen your type before. You're used to beating people who can't defend themselves. A fair fight, though. You're a pussy."
"Ignore him,"
said Sokolov. They had made 2 significant mistakes. The first was using Karpov. He might be back on his feet, but he wouldn't be at 100%. The radio crackled.
3 minutes.
The other mistake was bringing Cooper into a room this small. They'd probably been limited in their choice, but they should have expected that in a space this small, someone like Cooper could move more quickly than Sokolov could fire his gun. "Does your boss know what else you get up to in Queens? The drinking? The massage parlour?" Karpov's eyes briefly flitted towards Sokolov, still standing in the corner. "Oh, I've touched a nerve, haven't I? That's why you're here. It's not because you're good. It's because you've got connections."
"Shut up,"
said Karpov. "It's why the Russian system will never work. It's corrupt, and corruption breeds inefficiencies. It allows clowns like you to get posted to places like New York." Karpov took a step forward and pointed at Cooper.
"I said, shut up."
Cooper needed Karpov to take one more step forward. "Are you a better fighter when you're sober?" Sokolov saw in that moment what Cooper was doing. He looked up with alarm in his blue eyes.
"Get back against the door!"
He barked at Karpov. "Get back!" But a switch had flicked in Karpov's head. He needed to restore his reputation by hurting Cooper, and his feet were already moving. As he shifted his considerable bulk forwards, Cooper pushed off the wall in a blur. It all happened too quickly for Sokolov to react. By the time he'd steadied his firing arm, Cooper had met Karpov in the middle of the room, slipping underneath Karpov's slow-looping punch. Completely shielded from Sokolov, Cooper braced his legs and pushed Karpov hard, so he tumbled towards the other Russian, falling on the gun. Sokolov cursed, trying to push Karpov to one side, but Karpov weighed close to 300 pounds, and once he was set in motion, it took something significant to stop him, especially when Cooper kicked him in the back, accelerating his momentum. Both Russians tumbled backwards against the wall. Sokolov's hands were trapped, allowing Cooper an open target. His first blow exploded Sokolov's nose. Sokolov opened his mouth to shout, teeth stained with blood. He pulled the trigger. The bullets thudded into Karpov. Cooper hit him again, a jarring blow to his temple. Sokolov blinked and swayed, his firing arm half raised. Cooper brought the heel of his hand directly into contact with Sokolov's neck, crushing his throat and killing him instantly. There was a crackle. Sokolov's radio had fallen to the ground in the struggle. Cooper opened the door and looked both ways down an empty corridor.
1 minute, he heard on the radio. Bring him up. We're ready.
Cooper leaned down to remove the Russian pin from Sokolov's jacket. He wasn't usually one for souvenirs, but this felt like a good day to make an exception. Chapter 26. Control put his hands together.
It's ended up as a significant humiliation for the Russians. To trigger a code blue, but then be forced to retract and apologize for wasting the General Assembly's time, it's the first time the UN's seen anything like it. It's a humiliation.
Cooper stood with his back pressed against the wall, crowds milling around him. He was in the main New York City Greyhound station, located at the Port Authority bus terminal in Midtown Manhattan. It was one of the largest and busiest bus terminals in the world, making it hard for the authorities to monitor. He glanced up at the departures board. With transfers in Atlanta and Dallas, he could be in Tucson, Arizona the next day. From there, it would be easy to find a way across the border into Mexico. He'd been checking the news constantly, waiting for a story to break about bodies being discovered inside the UN headquarters, and was ready to run at a moment's notice. "I'm still in New York, sir. Is there any sign that the spotlight is on me? If so, I can head south."
"I'd prefer it if you took a cab to JFK, bought yourself a first-class ticket, and came back to London the usual way."
First class? Since when was that the usual way?
The head of security for the Russians was the first to find the bodies. They removed the bodies and scrubbed the room. So as far as both the UN and the NYPD are concerned, nothing happened. You're in the clear.
Understood, sir. I'll be back in London tomorrow for a full debrief.
"We have put other personnel on your young Russian friend," said Control, "the one receiving treatment in a private hospital. They'll make sure that she's safe and handle her debrief and relocation to the West Coast as per her request once she's recovered."
Cooper was relieved to hear that. He knew the Russians pursued defectors, but if Control was overseeing Irina's relocation and protection, it would be done according to the most exacting standards.
"I can't remember a time that we sailed so close to the wind," said Control. "I don't like it one bit. We were seconds away from a very serious problem. I'm under no illusion that we would have been forced to close the program down."
There was a pause. Cooper knew better than to interrupt. Control was normally extremely efficient in how he spoke, rarely wasting a word. For him, this was garrulous.
"I also don't like the fact that I sent you into a trap," he said. "Failing to identify that North Star was working for the Russians is on me. I should have done better. I want you to lie low for a while. There's no sign that you're implicated in any of this, but I don't want to take any chances. Once you're back on British soil, take a few weeks off."
Cooper watched the crowds of New Yorkers surge one way and then the other in front of him. As much as he loved Britain's history and tradition, he always had the sense here in New York that he was watching a grand experiment play out before his eyes, one involving the most diverse cast imaginable. None of the clichés about New York's energy and vibrancy came close to the truth. "Sir, may I make a request?"
"Name it."
"Send me after North Star. He knows too much. He might try again. If he's blown it with the Russians, there'd be the Chinese or the Iranians. Send me after him."
"There are already steps underway to deal with him."
"I'm not surprised. I want to be at the heart of it." This time, the silence continued for long enough that Cooper questioned whether the line had been cut. "All right," Control said. "Thank you, sir. I'll start immediately.
"There's just one condition."
"Sir?"
"This one's personal.